Mauler, do you wish to shed this curse? Then accept the fate of your ilk, and face the trials that await you. Unless you have already joined the Crestfallen.
You can practically hear the developers laughing at your expense as she says this. They're basically saying, we made this game really hard, that's what you wanted, right? It feels to me like difficulty was a big focus in Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 2, I got the impression the developers were asking themselves, how can we make this fight difficult?
Half-grown hollow, have you what it takes? Truly?
The player will realize that the developer intention was for them to die a lot no matter how much they try to learn. Dark Souls 2 is a bad game, and dying in Dark Souls 2 is the developer's fault so much of the time that I didn't enjoy the game when the deaths were actually my fault. I hate Dark Souls 2 more than almost any other game I have ever played.
Still got hit even though I dodged and it didn't show hitting him. Great. I don't know how I just got hit. The game's full of shit. He didn't fucking touch me. I'm dodging. Dude, he was in the animation. What the fuck?
This cutscene embodies everything wrong with this game, in my opinion. It's difficulty for difficulty's sake, it's not trying to be fair, it is a caricature of the series.
We made this game really hard, that's what you wanted, right?
The enemies and where they're placed in Dark Souls 2 is just objectively god awful. There are too many of them, and they aggro from way too far away, and honestly, half the time I just wanted to throw my controller like a boomerang at the wall most of the time I played it. It was obviously meant to be a sequel to Dark Souls. I mean, it's in the freaking name, but in actuality, it's really anything but.
Young Hollow, knowing this, do you still desire peace?
10 things off, I'm sure this will come as a surprise to no one, but to me Dark Souls 2 is not just a bad Souls game, it's a bad game. So many of its issues are just inexcusable when it comes to the core design.
This combined with several other fundamentals that we shall be getting to enhance the levels of absolute incompetency when it comes to trying to craft a challenge. Please stop spamming me.
Oh my god, 5 enemies against me, so fucking fun.
It's complete bullshit.
Young Hollow, are you intent on shattering the yoke? Spoiling this wonderful falsehood? Men are props in state of life, and no matter how tender, how exquisite, a lie will remain a lie. We are bound by this yoke.
Dark Souls 2 was once a highly regarded game, but its reputation has been tragically damaged by the internet. It all started with a viral video from a YouTuber named Matthewmatosis. As I will categorically prove, his critique was poorly written. Nearly every argument provided by Matthew is either incorrect, dishonest, or unfairly presented, and the few reasonable points he makes are either no more than minor nitpicks, or were already addressed in the Scholar of the First Sin version of the game. Throughout the video, he smugly insults the game developers, portraying them as incompetent hacks, and Dark Souls 2 as a soulless imitation of its predecessors. As bad as that video was, it gained traction, and soon, his views became the consensus. A wave of midwits followed in his footsteps, regurgitating his arguments in critique videos of their own. Like when a middle school student copies and pastes an article from Wikipedia, but changes a few words throughout to not make it obvious. And they were even worse and more unhinged than his. There was this one Redditor who made a 10-hour-long SLOP critique that was so cringe-inducing and so fraudulent, it truly baffles me that people fell for it. Throughout the entire critique, he stages gameplay to make it seem as though Dark Souls 2 is unfair, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Here's a clip of me doing the same thing in Dark Souls 3. And here's me doing the same thing in Dark Souls 1. His critique hinges on you being stupid, or having never played the game yourself. Thankfully, as of recently, response videos that expose him for the bad player and game reviewer he is have been made by a channel named Domo3000, which I recommend in case you're interested in this rabbit hole. Now, thanks in huge parts to these YouTubers, people slander Dark Souls 2 as a poorly designed game and a bad sequel to Dark Souls 1. Even people who've never played the game feel entitled to talk about it because they've watched videos about it, and newcomers to the series are often told to skip it entirely. Its brilliant story is moronically disregarded as fanfiction by clueless fools, and its many innovations, which deeply influenced From Software's later games, are waved away. In this video, I will address the root of Dark Souls 2's infamy. I will categorically deconstruct and debunk Matthewmatosis' critique.
The way that Dark Souls 2 deviates from the high standards set in Dark Souls 1 can be surprisingly difficult to pinpoint. People's perception of the problems in the game grew slowly, and I think it's fair to say that the video released by Matthewmatosis was the tipping point for when many Dark Souls fans realized that something was wrong with the sequel. But I still think it's fair to say that the exposure this video received is a significant number of people who played the game and discuss it with others.
I've been playing for a while now and hoping that the game would grow on me more than it did initially, but unfortunately I've found it to be a pretty disappointing experience. The first major problem with Dark Souls 2 happens less than a minute into the introduction. Rather than being booted directly into the character creation screen like the previous games, this one waits until after an opening sequence before asking you to make your character. This means the character's identity has to be hidden by their clothing until that point, but they do a really poor job of this since the character's build obviously looks male. Once you arrive at things betwixt, you can even take your clothes off and confirm it. Not only that, but there's an utterly pointless flashback sequence which also indicates the character is a guy as well. You could maybe pass this off by saying it's not a flashback of the player character, but in that case it has no reason to exist. It feels tonally out of place in the Souls series, which has always left the player character's history up to players themselves, and completely conflicts with any female characters.
The critique starts out on a bad note, as Matthew misses what the cinematic is about. The narrator says a hallowing undead eventually forgets the memory of his very birth. It is a poetic, surreal concept. It's as though every memory fades from his mind in reverse chronological order until he becomes no one. Thus, the scene in question depicts his early memories melting away. He is the baby being cradled by his mother, and not, as Matthew suggested, the husband of the woman. In fact, let me explain the first half of this sequence in detail to show just how dumb Matthew sounds when talking about it. As he moves forward, unaware of where the journey will take him, the hallowing undead struggles to keep his wits, and his body fails him as he falls to the ground. He is, in real time, losing his earliest memories. The undead suddenly finds himself within a hut in a forest, where an old witch spins a thread. A character symbolic of the fates of Greek myth, the protagonist is but a pawn of a greater scheme. The jarring cuts of this sequence portray the way the protagonist experiences reality. It's like he jumps through time, incoherently. As he approaches the door to leave, extending his hands to the handle, he is reaching for his mother, and for himself as a baby. We then see him jump back to reality, his hand hesitating as the witch says he will become a thing that feeds on souls, a hollow. Despite her blindness, the witch can see right through him. He was one among countless souls who had walked that path, all of them wandering like moths to a flame. Then, she tells him of Drung Lake, a kingdom that inhabits the dreams of hollows. Of course, Matthew dismisses all of this, because he clearly didn't pay the slightest attention to the game, calling this stunning cinematic an utterly pointless flashback sequence. And, he posits, if the sequence's protagonist isn't the player character, it has no place to exist. Indeed, that cutscene isn't even necessarily depicting the player character, but one of the many hollows who travel to Drung Lake. Every hollow you fight in the tutorial area has that exact look. One of the main themes of Dark Souls 2 is what it means to be and lose yourself, which is why the opening cinematic focuses on identity and memory. It also sets the surrealist, somber, melancholic tone of the game with its dense atmosphere. It is written and shot like a nightmare. Even if the player character isn't directly being portrayed in that cutscene, he fulfills the same role as that journeying undead. There are many who've come before him after all. Matthew is clearly ignorant of general storytelling principles and can't understand even the game's most basic plot points, as he himself admits later. He disrespectfully disregards a layered sequence rich with symbolism that accomplishes many things at once. It sets the tone of the game, presents the main themes of the story, introduces the archetypal protagonists, the old firekeepers, Drung Lake, and the dreamlike nature of the world of Dark Souls 2, with the intriguing exposition masterfully integrated into the scene, all the while being aesthetically amazing. Outside of other From Software titles, I can hardly think of a game cinematic as incredible as this one. Only artistic masterpieces of parallel quality come to mind. Yet another thing Matthew misunderstood is that hollows are genderless. The more someone loses themselves, their identity, the less genders they become. In the first game's opening cinematic, we see that the pygmies, the ancestors of humanity, were just like the hollows, and they all looked the same. They lacked individuality, for they had little soul within them. This concept is inspired by esoteric readings of the Book of Genesis, as Adam, the primordial man, before Eve's creation, was also genderless, as the notion of sexes didn't yet exist. Our character is quite literally reshaped as he interacts with a human effigy. He regains his humanity, and thus can remember how he looks like, his occupation, and so on. Dark Souls 2's character creation was ingeniously integrated into the game's narrative.
At least you know your own name. Here's your reward for sharing. It's a human effigy. Take a closer look. Who do you think it's supposed to be? Think back, deep into your past.
In the tutorial area, there's a gender-changing mechanism that operates under the same logic. The protagonist jumps into a coffin that takes him or her to the deep, dark sea, and upon resurfacing, he or she changed his or her memory of himself or herself. The Soul Vessel, an item that says in its description that without proper assistance, it may drain you of souls, whose design appears to be a darkened, drained heart with a water-like liquid within it, can be used to change your character's build. The memories of the protagonist are volatile from the start, just as is the memory of Drung Lake itself, the kingdom he's exploring.
This whole thing feels like they went to the trouble of creating an FMV trailer and then had to find some way to retrofit it onto the game itself. After choosing a character, the old ladies then say,
You lose your souls. All of them. Over and over again.
You can practically hear the developers laughing at your expense as she says this. They're basically saying, we made this game really hard, that's what you wanted, right?
Again, Matthew fails to understand what the scene is communicating to the player. The player character is a nameless, accursed undead. He's a nobody, and the Firekeepers have seen countless adventurers like him, all of whom have failed. They provide the undead with advice, though they can't help but laugh at him. They've become cynical and bitter over the ages. The arguments that this dialogue goes against what Dark Souls 1 and even Demon Souls are about is completely bogus to anyone who's played them. The first NPC we meet in both of those games is a crestfallen warrior who parallels the player character and is just as pessimistic as the Firekeepers of Dark Souls 2. He tells us that it's pointless to try at all, because we'll die again and again, only to give up like he did. The first NPC we meet in both Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring also shames us for being weak. It's simply an iconic From Software tradition to present the player as the underdog, often mocking him for it, challenging him to prove the characters wrong, and it feels empowering to do so.
Now, it's no secret that Miyazaki, the director of the previous two Souls games, wasn't brought back as the director for Dark Souls 2, but his insight into the previous games can still say a lot about this game. In practically every interview he's ever taken since the release of Demon Souls, Miyazaki is asked to comment on the difficulty of the Souls games, and the answer that he gives, over and over again, is that difficulty was never the point. It feels to me like difficulty was a big focus in Dark Souls 2, which is a crucial misunderstanding on the part of the new directors of this game, probably helped along with some pushing from Namco, who have enjoyed playing the difficulty card for marketing purposes since before the release of Dark Souls.
Matthew then goes on to claim that Miyazaki has stated, over and over again, that difficulty was never the point, which is a very misleading way of framing what Miyazaki has actually said. Miyazaki did say, one time, and not over and over again, that difficulty was not the goal, but a necessity to create a satisfying experience for the player. Matthew then extrapolates his explanation to mean that difficulty was never the point. Difficulty was intrinsically related to the point. It was a tool to force the player to strategize, to overcome obstacles and discover new things, to create a great sense of accomplishment. Miyazaki went on to clarify, on a later interview, that, quote, if we had to choose between difficulty or enjoyability, there's no doubt we would prioritize difficulty, end quote. What Miyazaki did say, over and over again, was that difficulty was an integral part of the experience, of the very identity of his games. Matthew is either lying on purpose, or unknowingly misquoting Miyazaki so he can complain about Dark Souls 2's difficulty, as he got filtered by it, and had his ego torn down. Here is another excerpt from an interview with Miyazaki, which is precisely about Demon Souls, the game Matthew loves to compare Dark Souls 2 with, so he can spread misinformation and say stupid nonsense about the latter. Quote, Demon Souls embraces the trial and error difficulty, and will leave the player to work things out for himself. End quote. Here is another quote. Demon Souls was known for its incredible difficulty. With Dark Souls, there is no intention to decrease the difficulty at all. Actually, we intend to increase the difficulty. End quote. Miyazaki then goes on to explain he intends for the player to farm different strategies to progress through the game, something Matthew is allergic to, as I will soon prove. By his own admission, he's played through the entire game with just a sword and shield, going directly against Miyazaki's philosophy for designing the difficulty of his games. Of course, the game can still be easily beaten with such a setup, by good players that is. Whenever the game compels you to leave your comfort zone, or to think outside the box, to rethink your strategies, you can either brute force through it, with skill alone, or abide by the game's demands to succeed. Matthew decided to blame the game, and its developers, for his own faults instead, talking as though they had betrayed Miyazaki by making Dark Souls 2 too difficult, when in reality, they followed his exact philosophy, and were supervised by him. As a brief aside, this part of the critique reminded me of a video I've watched recently. I'll play an excerpt of it for you. See if you can spot a pattern.
Dark Souls 2 is the only game where I went hollow, where I gave up, not even at a boss, mind you, just at a random place in the Crown of the Sunken DLC, but I have a duty. I have a duty to anyone who has ever loved Dark Souls 2 to finish the DLC for this video and make Dark Souls 2 great again. Okay, I just reused that joke.
I've seen a lot of negative DS2 reviews, but still haven't seen a DS2 hater that understands how to play Souls games. Imagine being in the DLC and still greedily trying to open chests without dealing with the surrounding enemies first.
Send another pyramid and open a chest that I kept dying at.
And then imagine repeatedly dying in the same situation without considering if you could do something different. That's how DS2 haters actually play.
This dude straight up admitted to carelessly running through a late game area over and over again, attracting the attention of every enemy along his path, ignoring the area's mechanics, only to try and open a chest while they're chasing him, and blames the game for it. And that SLOP has more than 500,000 views and 15,000 likes. This is unbelievable. Most so-called reviews or critiques of Dark Souls 2 are just overindulgent rants made by players worse than the worst type of game journalists, who go on to write articles demanding an easy mode. Would you trust a semi-illiterate person to review Shakespeare? No sane person would. Then why is the popular discourse surrounding Dark Souls 2 shaped by people who play like they have a brainworm impairing them, or something, and proceeds to blame the game for their own faults? There's this one place as the Forest of the Fallen Giants, the first area of the game, where the game teaches you shouldn't rush through it with your brain turned off, but explore with care and attention. There are about 10 enemies leaping around, who wake up once the player walks near them, a mechanic that was introduced in the previous section of the map. The smart player will soon realize the gimmick, and wake them up one by one. The stupid player ignores them and runs around carelessly, waking all of them up at once, gets ganked for it, and dies. If, God forbid, you end up watching one or more of these garbage videos about Dark Souls 2, see if you can spot a clip of the YouTuber get destroyed by this beginner area as they complain about the game. Many of them have won. Back on the topic of difficulty as an integral part of the Souls series, the original cover art of Demon Souls is a dying knight wearing the same armor as the protagonist of that game's opening cinematic, and of the knight class, which is the first option offered to the player. Also, as Matthew points out, the complete edition of Dark Souls 1 is titled Prepare to Die. Death is also integral to the lore, to the world building, to the story, to the themes of the Dark Souls series, to Demon Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Rings too. The death of the player character is canonically integrated into the mechanics of their universes. Matthew ignorantly portrays all of this as an issue, and not only that, has an issue exclusive to Dark Souls 2, and baselessly claims that Bandai Namco must have asked the developers of Dark Souls 2 to ramp up the difficulty for marketing purposes, portraying them not as artists who made a deliberate decision that also goes in line with the design philosophy of the series, but as cogs of a machine who had to compromise their work for the sake of appeasing a publisher.
As soon as you get to Majula, there's even a counter tracking the number of deaths. You can also go online and see a full breakdown of the ways people have died.
He also points out the existence of Majula's memorial, and denounces it as a way for the game to boast about its difficulty, failing to notice the irony in his statement, which ignores the rich symbolism behind it. Below the monument is a cemetery known as the Grave of Saints. The undead who seek to link the fire are considered martyrs, and their suffering, their deaths, sanctifies them. The fire-linking ideology and religion is heavily based on Christianity, and the notion of suffering being a sanctifying force comes directly from it. It is no accident that the memorial is vaguely shaped like a cross, and like the coiled sword of the bonfires. The monument may, at first glance, be interpreted by someone with the mentality of the crestfallen warrior as a mockery of his failures, but, in reality, it is a beacon of hope in a hopeless world, like the humble but beautiful village of Majula as a whole, whose name means to progress. And just like the crestfallen knight, who sits beside the memorial, finds hope as his character evolves, so does the death counter get recontextualized once the player finishes the game, as a way for the game to glorify his courage and perseverance in face of adversity. Matthew entirely disregards the in-universe purpose of the monument, its symbolic meaning, portraying it as no more than a joke done in poor taste. He's just like the crestfallen knight before his development, a sore loser who can't see the beauty of the world around him.
The most obvious way this has been misunderstood, however, is with the boss fights. In Dark Souls 2, I got the impression the developers were asking themselves, how can we make this fight difficult? Whereas the question they should have asked is, how can we make this fight interesting? A good comparison is the Royal Rat Authority and Sif. The fight with the Royal Rat Authority is much more difficult, but Sif is far more memorable. Difficulty doesn't necessarily equate to a good experience even in a Souls game. One of the first images that pops into my mind when I think of Dark Souls is a giant, proud-looking wolf wielding an enormous sword while protecting the grave of his master. The Royal Rat Authority, on the other hand, is a retread of the Sif fight with 4 random enemies which inflict toxin slapped in front of it to make it harder. If you manage to kill the 4 rats, the fight is practically over, but unless you're a pyromancer, it's a crapshoot about whether you'll manage to get them all before the giant one mauls you to death. Similar problems extend to other boss fights, which seem to follow the mantra, if you can't make it good, make it difficult by adding more stuff. Rather than make the Freya fight difficult by giving her a challenging moveset, the designers just drop some random spiders into the battle instead. The epitome of this lazy mindset is the Belfry Gargoyles, a copy-pasted setup except this time there can be more of them active at once.
Matthew goes on to complain about the boss fights, which, according to him, were designed not with interesting mechanics in mind, but simply difficulty, when that is obviously not the case. With each example provided, he proves to have missed the point of these fights entirely. He fails to realize the gimmicks behind them, the lessons they aim to teach the player, and denounces them as lazy. He contrasts the Royal Rat Authority to Sif, a nonsensical comparison gameplay-wise. Yes, one parallels the other narratively to an extent, and looks somewhat similar visually, but their fights are entirely different. A more apt comparison would be with the Capra Demon boss fight. Sif is a mandatory boss fight that begins with a cutscene. Indeed, it is one of the more memorable moments of the first game. Instead of comparing it to a boss like Vel'Staz, a mandatory boss fight that begins with a cutscene, in which we fight at an equivalent point of the game, he compares it to the Royal Rat Authority, an optional, hidden challenge that is tied to a niche covenant. He complains that, unless you're a pyromancer, it is a crapshoot to kill the rats, and comically shows a clip of him shooting the toxic inflicting enemies with poison arrows, which deal minimal damage outside of the ailments they inflict, an ailment which the rats are resistant to. He is also attacking the poisonous boss with a poison scimitar. This is DSP Gaming, our game journalist tier gameplay. I can also provide anecdotal evidence against the claim that this boss fight is unfair. I recently played Dark Souls 1 and 2 with my girlfriend, who was, before these playthroughs, a casual gamer. She was into games like Animal Crossing, Red Dead Redemption, and The Sims. I helped her through co-op, but avoided holding her hands too much. Yet, she didn't think Dark Souls 2 was harder than the first game at all, and even managed to beat, by herself, without cheesing or looking up a guide, Vendrick, the Ancient Dragon, and the Dark Lurker. The Royal Rat Authority is also a boss fight you can't summon for. She quickly realized the shield wouldn't be very useful against the little rats and then equipped hers. She was playing a sorcerer build, and after her first death, she also noticed she had to take out the lesser rats from afar before alerting the authority. Though she struggled with the boss fight at first, for she was somewhat underleveled when she found it, she left it for later, realizing it was a spike in difficulty, and came back stronger, though not overpowered, and easily defeated it. In contrast to her, Matthew never managed to kill the lesser rats before taking on the bigger one. As said before, he tried shooting them with poison arrows, and, for some reason, instead of locking onto them, he tried manually aiming, which caused him to miss shots and slowed him down. He also used the shield against them, despite it being clearly inefficient as you can be attacked from multiple sides at the same time, as showcased in his gameplay. He talks about how most of the Dark Souls 2 multiple enemy boss fights are lazily designed and feature artificial difficulty, citing some of them as examples. I will debunk his points one by one. The Royal Rat Authority is, essentially, at the end of an area full of traps and ambushes. The same is true for the Vanguard. The game teaches you to deal with the pesky rat enemies way before you can challenge the bosses, and also expects you to have learned to use your brain to deal with their shenanigans. The Freya boss fight features multiple enemy spiders, which the game had also introduced exclusively through ambushes and similar scenarios, much earlier. The Freya fight also features a unique mechanic. The player can only hit her on her two heads, as her body is nearly as durable as the stone scales of the everlasting dragons. This gimmick, paired with her laser attack and the multiple spiders, make the fight flow like a horror-themed merry-go-round, with the player strafing her attacks and avoiding the spiders while searching for her weak spots. In Scholar of the First Sin, the boss was even nerfed. The cautious and attentive player would know to scare the spiders away with a torch. By using the mechanic, you trivialize the fight, as the spiders don't even try to attack you. They run away, scared by the flame. The Belfry Gargoyles are both a test of the player's crowd control skills, as well as of his target assessment capabilities. Attentive, intelligent players may learn that it is more beneficial to focus on one gargoyle at a time. The additional gargoyles spawn when their collective HP bar reaches certain thresholds, the usual trigger for a change in the phase of a fight, an idea which the game has been teaching you since its very first boss encounter through The Last Giant. Those who've played Dark Souls 1 would also know that the second gargoyle only appears once the player takes about half of the other's HP.
This all might have been fine, except it doesn't play to the series' strengths whatsoever. The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements, thanks to its slow attack animations which are uninterruptible once they start, and a lock-on camera which focuses heavily on a single foe.
After slandering a few bosses, Matthew baselessly claims, in an authoritative tone, that the mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one encounters. That is obviously incorrect. Since Demon Souls the player is expected to deal with ambushes, with magicians and bowmen sniping you, while melee fighters attack you from close range, with encounters that feature multiple enemies attacking you at once more generally. Just because you have the option of locking onto one enemy to focus your attacks on him, does not mean the mechanic is useless when there's more than one enemy present, nor that the mechanic was only designed for you to fight one at a time. After all, you can change lock on targets just by tilting the right analog stick. The game also never teaches you to be locked on at all times. This was also something my girlfriend realized on her own. She asked me, during her Dark Souls 1 playthrough, if it wouldn't be better to not lock on when there's multiple enemies targeting her at once, when she was going through the Undead Burg. To dispel this blatant falsehood that hack reviewers like to repeat like a broken record, I'll show you just how little Dark Souls 1 focused on single enemy encounters. On screen you're seeing a quick run through from the Firelink Shrine to the Taurus Demon. The vast majority of encounters feature multiple enemies, often more than 3. In fact, one-on-one encounters are almost non-existent, and reserved for bosses and mini-bosses. The only game developed by From Software from Demon Souls onwards that focuses on single enemy encounters is Sekiro. Can you see just how easy it is for some people to believe in a lie just because it is repeated uncritically? This is the herd mentality phenomenon at work.
Take the Prowling Magus fight for example. If you want to kill one of the crawling undead littering this fight, your eyes need to be taken off the casters at the back in order to lock on. From there, you'll have 3 enemies shooting you at once, and since most actions aren't interruptible once they start, it's extremely difficult to know when a safe time is to start an attack animation without having vision of the enemy.
As proof for the combat system failing to account for multiple enemies, Matthew calls our attention to his pitiful, game journalist-like gameplay once again. He complains about not being able to kill the undead who are crawling on the ground, and can barely do anything while he gets attacked by the casters. He should obviously be prioritizing. It's truly ironic how Matthew speaks so confidently about the supposed fault of the game, while not paying the slightest attention to what the game is trying to teach him. It's beyond cringe.
The twin dragon riders are another example of this. You want to avoid attacks from both of them while periodically damaging one of them, but in order to do so you need to lock onto one and position yourself in such a way so you can see the other. This could have been mitigated by better audio cues on the bow as it's loaded and fired, but this is seriously overshadowed by the music. I found myself having to repetitively run up and down the arena so I could keep both of them on screen, feeling like I was fighting the controls more than the bosses themselves.
He then complains about the twin dragon riders, because the archer shoots you while the other enemy charges at you. Just because you can't see the archer directly, at all times, it doesn't mean this encounter is unfair. You can easily avoid the shots with good positioning, and by walking around the arena, or by rolling when you hear the bow string. Being completely honest, by this point of the critique, I'm quite certain that he is deliberately arguing in bad faith. There's just no way that he can be this cartoonishly terrible as the game. This isn't just an ad hominem, as it pertains to his arguments. He is completely misjudging the combat mechanics because he fails to learn and experiment with them. He proceeds to claim he had more issue with the controls than with the enemies themselves. A skill issue, yet he blames the game for his own incompetence. It may be that he's being exceedingly hyperbolic in his words, and has staged those pure gameplay clips where he keeps erratically changing the lock on target for no reason. I believe the truth lies somewhere in between. He is, truly, terrible at this game, and has failed not only to master, but to soberly comprehend its core mechanics. Yet he's not dumb enough as to be utterly clueless about them to the point where he seems to be mindlessly mashing his right analog stick, to artificially emphasize his baseless, yet arrogantly delivered claim that the combat is designed around encounters with a singular enemy.
The variety in bosses is severely lacking, with far too many being oversized humanoid figures with giant weapons.
Matthew claims that the variety in bosses is severely lacking, with far too many of them being oversized humanoids with giant weapons. And, in doing so, he blatantly disregards the various unique mechanics of each boss. Nearly every oversized humanoid has a supplementary gimmick which the player must deal with. For a specific example, I'll talk about the fight Matthew was showing alongside his commentary. The Lost Sinner is an impulse swordsman who punishes you for backing away from him, and from consuming healing items. He can parry the player, which is something no other boss could do, including those of Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. He also frequently dodges the player's attacks. But beyond his moveset, there's his arena, which is exceedingly dark, making it hard to learn his patterns and identify safe opportunities to attack, and also lowering the range of your lock-on, unless you're using a torch. You can circumvent this environmental hazard by exploring the area and lighting the arena with your torch from the outside, or by playing efficiently and carefully. The Smelter Demon, which Matthew also uses as an example for his claim, forces the player to deal with a passive damage effect that gets more aggressive as the fight goes on. It can be done by minimizing contact with the boss, by carefully punishing lengthier openings, or by tactically consuming slower healing items, or by approaching the fight from long range, or even by exploring the area and unlocking the Door of Pharaohs, which provides a pond of water that mitigates fire damage more generally. The bosses of Dark Souls 1 are about as complex as those of Dark Souls 2 on average. There's more variety in their silhouettes, but there are less of them. This argument is somewhat arbitrary and unfairly presented.
Attacks also lock on to an unnecessary degree, far more than in previous installments where enemies usually had movesets with their own weaknesses and strengths. When a boss goes to do an overhead attack, it will usually track the player up until the very last moment before impact, even if this means the boss has to spin around like they're standing on top of a record player. Bosses should have movesets which don't rely on tracking the player in such a cheap, simplistic way. Regular enemy attacks do this excessive amount of tracking as well, even when it's completely unnecessary. Take the turtle armoured enemies for instance. Despite their massive suit of armour, they'll follow the player 360 degrees on any of their attacks. The sad thing is these enemies have a built-in countermeasure for any player who gets behind them, so there's no excuse for them to be constantly facing the player. The challenge here should have been to try staying to the side of the enemy without getting too close to the front or the back. Instead, they just require the same tactics as every other enemy in the game.
His next complaint is that the enemies have exaggerated tracking, like they're standing on a record player, which is more of an issue with animation than gameplay, as the attacks with heavy tracking can still be avoided by methodic spacing or dealt with through other means, such as keeping your distance or using a shield, and, more obviously, by rolling. Enemies from Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls still had this issue with their animations, but it is slightly more prevalent in Dark Souls 2, and for good reason, as simply walking around most humanoid enemies completely trivialized their movesets in the first game, and the developers had to fix that problem in the sequel. The issue of tracking was only satisfyingly mitigated in Dark Souls 3. It would be far too easy if enemies had weaker tracking, as the player would be able to roll through their moves without care for timing or spacing. It's also possible that an inverse issue would be created, as, with neuter tracking, attacks would miss far too often, making the enemies look incompetent. Indeed, even if the supposedly absurd tracking that is totally exclusive to Dark Souls 2, it is still possible to easily avoid overhead swings by walking, or, in extreme cases, running to the side. Matthew uses as an example of a good moveset with no tracking, the Adjudicators, a giant, fat, slimy, borderline immobile boss that can only do a single attack that is easily avoidable and exploitable. I love the Adjudicator boss fight. It is a great early game boss, but to use it as an example of an enemy with a balanced moveset is laughable. Here's a clip of me fighting the Pursuer with base ADP. Something many people don't know is that the Pursuer has a different moveset for each encounter. When you first meet him, his moveset can be almost entirely negated by simply strafing to the side. Only one or two of his moves require a dodge. The game teaches you from the start that you can strafe some attacks and dodge others. Matthew then claims that the ironclad soldiers can follow the player 365 degrees with their attacks, while showing a clip of himself avoiding an overhead smash simply by walking to the side, doing, exactly, what he describes as the interesting approach for the enemy's design to ask of the player. Look at where the soldier's weapon is when Matthew rolls. He wouldn't get hit at all if he simply committed to the strafing. In the very clip he presented to his audience, we can see that the tracking of the enemy is about 90 degrees at most.
It's not just bosses that suffer from the mentality that more enemies somehow makes the gameplay better. The regular enemy placements fall into this trap as well. There's far more groups in Dark Souls 2 which automatically aggro together in clumps, forcing the player to fight against 2 or 3 difficult enemies at a time. Dark Souls 1 had a lot of mobs as well, but they were balanced around this idea. Mob enemies would have low health, lack a shield, or do comparatively little damage, sometimes all 3. Dark Souls 2 just haphazardly places massive enemies all over the place. Dealing with multiple strong enemies like this comes across as a hassle rather than an interesting fight, which encourages players to use cheap tactics instead of playing fair.
His point about enemy ganks is an unfair generalization, but valid in a few rare instances, such as the example he provided of the 2 Primal Knights waking up at the same time. Most enemy encounters in Dark Souls 2 are just as balanced as those of previous games. Here's a clip of me easily taking out the 2 ogres of the Things Betwixt, an encounter often deemed unfair by players who don't understand what spacing means, as an example. Nearly all of the more annoying encounters were reworked for the Scholar of the First Sin edition of the game. In that version, there are but 3 or 4 unbalanced confrontations. Unfair enemy encounters are also present in Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1. Think of the egregious encounter with the gang of giants depraved ones in the Valley of Defilements. The player can barely move. Yes, the depraved ones are somewhat tanky, can one-shot the player in many situations, wield large weapons, and have fast attacks. It is one of the most punishing moments in the entirety of From Software's catalog. In Dark Souls 1, there's the monsters in the Demon Ruins, and the infamous Lost Izalith as a whole. I could go on, but the point is that, in the 3 aforementioned games, such instances are the exception and not the rule. Most of their areas, Dark Souls 2 included, are meticulously crafted, the placement of each enemy carefully considered.
In the previous Souls games, part of the challenge sometimes was getting back to a boss after failing to kill them. If the level didn't open a shortcut or there wasn't a nearby bonfire, you had to traverse the level again and then make it to the boss in good enough condition to kill it. This was one of the things that drew people to the series in the first place, because it was challenging but still very fair. Now look at this path to Velstalt in Dark Souls 2. It's a single corridor littered with no less than 7 heavily armoured enemies. There's no sense of progress slowly making your way down a corridor by fighting the same enemy 7 times, so you're far more likely to just run through it. This isn't level design, it's tedious, lazy and frustrating.
This next argument seems like parody to anyone who's plays Demon Souls. Matthew talks about how the player must minimize his mistakes as he navigates to the boss of an area, oftentimes alleviating his path through a shortcut. He denounces the Undead Crypt, an area with an extremely helpful shortcut right before the corridor, which leads to the boss, as poorly designed and lazy, because you are incentivized to run through its last hallway, while comparing, through footage, with the Part 2 section of the Shrine of Storms, a huge, difficult area with no shortcuts. Drangleic troops are guarding that chamber because their king is resting in there, so you can either kill them, or find a way to distract them to get to the boss. It's quite simple to understand. Can you really call that an issue? That is not so easy to do so, despite that being a late game area. Are most areas in the series poorly designed, because it is often easier to run through the enemies to get to the boss from the nearest bonfire, rather than kill each and every one of them every time. Killing every enemy the first time through an area to loot every item and find hidden paths, bonfires and shortcuts, and running through them in subsequent respawns, is the norm for most players since Demon Souls. And that specific corridor was reworked for the Scholar version of the game, and the runback is a bit more forgiving. For comparison's sake, here's a clip of me going through the area Matthew compares the Undead Crypts to. I'm only engaging with the enemies when it's efficient to do so, as any player would once they've explored the area.
Despite having a much more heavy-handed and long-winded introductory sequence, the plot of Dark Souls 2 plays itself out far more poorly than in the first game. The intro video to Dark Souls 1 establishes all the major players, which will become important later on, giving us an idea of what makes them special and what their role was in shaping the world the way it is. When we start the game proper, we're told about the curse of the undead, and our character has been imprisoned for carrying the curse. Then, after some indeterminate amount of time, Oscar breaks the player out of their cell. Shortly after, we find Oscar mortally wounded and he asks us to fulfill the prophecy of the undead by ringing the 2 bells of awakening. When we arrive in Lordran, that's our goal. Once the 2 bells are rung, we have no idea what to do next, but this awakens Frampt, who says we need the Lord Vessel to complete the prophecy, after which he explains he's seeking a successor for Gwyn so we can link the fire. Linking the fire seems like a good idea, so we probably want to go with that. This carries us to the end of the game where we succeed Gwyn. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist, especially for a first-time player. The intro video to Dark Souls 2 shows the main character dropping into some kind of whirlpool, because the old lady tells us we're cursed, and the only hope of a cure is to go to Drangleic for some reason. She actually says we'll have no idea why we're going to do any of the stuff we're about to do. Upon arrival, we go to a shed, and some more old ladies laugh at us. Then, after arriving in Majula, the maiden in green tells us to find the king. It's not explained why we might want to do this, but I suppose we can just imagine he has some kind of cure. On a hunch that the king has a cure, even though the entire kingdom is crawling with undead, we go and kill 4 powerful demons to open the Shrine of Winter. This allows us to get to Drangleic Castle, where the queen tells us to find the king. When we find him, he's gone hollow, so then, after some exploring, we go and talk to a dragon for some reason, and the dragon tells us to go into the memory of the giants for some reason, and this annoys the queen for some reason, so we kill her and take the throne for some reason. The pacing of Dark Souls 1 wasn't great after the Lord Vessel, but it did a lot more with a lot less when it came to its plot. Its introductory video set up the world and the major players very efficiently. I also think people underestimate how important Oscar is in Dark Souls. He's the one who kicks off the events of the entire game. Personally, I was never interested in the prophecy, but I wanted to honour the dying request of the guy who freed me, so it worked out either way. This is all the plot a Souls game needs. It seems to me that the new directors confused the obtuse nature of the lore in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls with the plot. The story was never complex in the previous Souls games, whereas the one in Dark Souls 2 was poorly presented and unnecessarily convoluted, which left me without a strong sense of purpose for most of the experience. Even now, replaying the game, I have no idea why my character agrees to start wandering Drangleic, killing everything inside at the start.
This next segment may as well be the most idiotic in the entire video. He basically summarizes Dark Souls 1's plot, and says he can't do the same for Dark Souls 2. The reason being, as is obnoxiously apparent by this point, Matthew either didn't pay the slightest attention to the game and its story, or is intellectually incapable of understanding its narrative, even at a surface level. I will now summarize Dark Souls 2 in the exact same way as he did for Dark Souls 1. We're introduced to Drangleic, a forgotten land that exists within the dreams of Hollows, a concept that echoes the dream quest of unknown Kadaf.
Perhaps you've seen it, maybe in a dream, a murky, forgotten land.
Hollows, being close to the dark, are drawn to the light, to the memory of Drangleic. They leap into the murky past through a portal of darkness and arrive in a dream realm.
Long ago, in a walled-off land far to the north, a great king built a great kingdom. I believe they called it Drangleic. Perhaps you're familiar. No, how could you be? But one day, you will stand before its decrepit gate without really knowing why. Like a moth drawn to a flame, your wings will burn in anguish. Time after time. For that is your fate. The fate of the cursed.
Once there, the player speaks to the old Firekeepers, and his motivation of breaking the curse is plainly stated. We've seen how horribly he's suffering from the effects of the Dark Sign moments before, so it makes perfect sense that he seeks to free himself from it.
All people come here for the same reason, to break the curse. You're no different, I should think.
Once he reaches Majula, he's told by the Emerald Heralds that he must seek for beings with immense souls and go see the king. When we enter Drangleic Castle, Chancellor Welager tells us that the king was seduced by a woman from a faraway land, who warned him about the looming threat across the sea, of the giants. The king invaded the giants' territory and defeated them. The Chancellor speaks of a time of peace brought forth by the queen, a peace like the dark itself, hinting at Nashandra's true nature. When we finally find the king, we discover that he fails to solve the curse and has gone hollow. By this point, by acquiring the king's ring, we gain access to the final boss, who's revealed to be Nashandra, the queen, who is actually a manifestation of the Abyss. Her goal, all along, was to absorb powerful souls, such as the king's, and now, yours. She wished for you to feed on souls so she could slay you, and claim them for herself, like the witch from Hansel and Gretel. She was overconfident in her power after she'd consumed Vendrick, and opted to challenge us directly, underestimating us, which was her greatest mistake. She does personify the want, the greed of the Abyss, after all, and her nature was her undoing. Just like the player character, she acted like a moth chasing a flame. After defeating her, we can link the fire, become a true monarch, which is revealed to be but a powerful martyr, and fulfill our duty. Again, this development is tied to the Christian subtext, as a true king is one who chooses self-sacrifice for man's sake, like Christ, the biblical King of Kings. We are told in narration that by linking the fire, souls flourish anew, and that all of this will play out again, reinforcing the themes of cycles and so on. So, in the end, we provided a new hope for the world, a new beginning, but our great effort was but a step towards a future resolution. And we were, from start to finish, like a moth chasing a flame, a pawn of a greater design, just like in Dark Souls 1, where we were first instructed by a prophecy, which told us we were the chosen one, and then manipulated by a god of illusion and his two primordial serpent friends who play both sides like the Bene Gesserit. One was literally called Sock Puppet, and the other was named after a false idol of the Old Testament. This summary does not take into account the DLCs, which introduced a whole new plotline in which the player actually manages to circumvent the curse for himself. The plot is merely the surface of the story, and I believe Dark Souls to be the greatest fantasy series ever written, with the richest fantasy world ever designed. I've made a 3-hour-long video explaining the true story of Dark Souls 2 in case you're interested. Shameless plug aside, let's go back to Matthew's non-argument. In summarizing the plot of Dark Souls 2, he implies that the player being somewhat clueless about the purpose of his quest is a bad thing, when, in Dark Souls 1, we're initially told to ring a bell, simply because we'll learn about the fate of the undead, and after ringing the bell, no such thing occurs. The first game is as vague as the second one, if not more so, and that is obviously by design. We are meant to question every step of our journeys, the hidden motivations of prophecy and of major players, and so on. The games respect the intelligence of the player by telling their stories in unconventional ways, shrouding them in mystery, which is great for passionate players like me, who love engaging with their literary character to solve their intricate secrets, but unfortunate for players like Matthew, who seem to want a Hollywood movie and not a profound work of art that can't be easily deciphered. Having said that, I honestly don't understand how Matthew could have enjoyed the first game's plot, when it is so similar in nature to the second game's, which he hated. The only reasonable argument he provides is that, in Dark Souls 1, we are emotionally invested in carrying Oscar's torch, but even this point is easily countered. In the second game, we're emotionally invested in solving the curse, as we're shown how it has tragically erased the protagonist's identity. Of course, Matthew rants about his lack of purpose throughout the game, which was caused by him watching the opening cinematic and playing through the introduction with the mentality of an annoying midwit who nitpicks at everything he doesn't understand, thinking himself to be smarter than the writers, instead of immersing himself in the world of the game and paying attention to the dialogue and to the visual storytelling.
I wish I could say it was only the main storyline which was a step backwards, but nearly everything involving the NPCs feels like a sharp downgrade from the first game. In Dark Souls 1, players find and rescue more and more NPCs which head back to the shrine for a rest. Those NPCs are often useful to the player in some way, but the genius of it is they also often disappear from the shrine at some point too. Each character in Dark Souls 1 feels like they have some kind of goal in the world, and the fact that they move from the shrine brings them to life. It feels like their usefulness as a vendor to the player is secondary to their own goals. You're not the center of the universe in Dark Souls 1 at all. Each character has their own little story they go through as the game progresses. This gives them all an air of believability and provides a satisfying sense of closure, even if that closure usually results in them going hollow. In Dark Souls 2, once an NPC arrives at Majula, they remain in the exact same location for the entirety of the game, and nothing of note happens to any of them during the entire playthrough. The worst example is the blacksmith's daughter, who sits on a rock just yards from her father and mentions he looks a little like her dad. Talking to the blacksmith reveals he's happy she's come home, and yet, no matter how much time elapses or how much you talk to either of them, nothing ever gives you the impression that the daughter has ever bothered to say one word to the blacksmith working just a little to her right, and vice versa.
Matthew's next argument is that the NPCs we meet in Majula do not leave the village once they station themselves there, which, again, misses the point entirely. This was done deliberately, as the character arcs of the Dark Souls 2 NPCs were written in the opposite direction. Instead of leaving the shrine and dying awful deaths, most of the characters station themselves in the village and become corrupted from the stagnation and complacency. Matthew fails to take into account the character development of said characters and their purpose, proving once more he is utterly clueless about storytelling and has weak pattern recognition skills when it comes to literary analysis. For example, Moglin, a poor, wandering merchant, who's initially shy and humble, comes to the village with the hope of finding good customers. He gradually becomes more confident, to the point of turning greedy and disrespectful once you buy enough items from him. Perhaps stationing himself there did more harm than good, as he was corrupted by avarice. Stagnation is equated with the Dark as a theme of this series, and King Vendrick himself goes through a similar character arc. Matthew hilariously complains about Cloane and Lenny Grass, once again missing the point entirely. I'm getting tired of repeating this line. Lenny Grass misses his daughter, but is too obsessed with his work to go speak to her. He partially hollowed because Melantia stole the key to his place while he was outside, and he couldn't find the resolve to look for it, for he was too attached to his anvil. Hollowing merely emphasized his true nature. He cares more for his work than for his daughter. Chloane, Lennygrath's daughter, has inherited her father's obsessive nature. She harvests titanite and similar goods from dead bodies, and has become infatuated with death. Attentive players would have realized that titanite and other upgrade materials are, essentially, remains of dead creatures, and bonfire ascetics are hearts of dead golems, giants included. Chloane is constantly gazing at the memento mori she holds in her hand, never bothering to move her head up to speak to the player, never leaving her sitting spot to go have a conversation with her father. Again an instance of complacency and stagnation being equated with the dark, with the curse. Matthew really believed he was so much smarter than the writers, pointing out how foolish they were to not have noticed the obvious. Oh, how incompetent they were for making such a stupid mistake, when, in truth, he was the fool who fails to understand that which was hidden in plain sight before him. Typical midwit behavior. To conclude this section, I'll point out an ingenious subversion of this arc structure. Salden, the crestfallen warrior of Dark Souls 2, has an inverse arc to Dark Souls 1's iteration of the archetype. In Dark Souls 1, he gets increasingly bothered by the visitors of the shrine, and decides to leave to New Londo out of bitterness, which results in his hollowing. In Dark Souls 2, Salden develops a sense of belonging the more people come to Majula. He's grateful for their companionship, and gifts a valuable ring of protection to the player, now confident he may succeed where he failed. Dark Souls 2's NPCs are all special in their own unique ways, just as the ones from Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1. It is but a matter of preference which ones you like more. You can say that, in your opinion, the arcs of those from the first game are more interesting, but that is not what Matthew does. He simply fails to understand the characters of Dark Souls 2.
I think FromSoft earned themselves some leeway since they were forced to switch from the world of Demon Souls to Dark Souls. It seemed natural they might want to carry a few things over. That's why I'm willing to overlook the appearance of Patches and the Crestfallen Warrior in Dark Souls 1, as well as the Maiden in Green in Dark Souls 2. The Crestfallen Warrior has already existed in this universe though, so seeing another character fulfill the same role with the same voice actor is really jarring. It really hurt my suspension of disbelief when all I could think about while talking to him was how coincidental it was to have the exact same character appearing again thousands of years later for no reason.
Matthew complains that some NPCs are based on archetypes seen before in the series, missing, yet again, the point. One of Dark Souls 2's main themes is that the world is cyclical, and, as explained before, in the main ending, the player is told that the souls of the one who links the fire reincarnate, they flourish anew. The four great beings he hunts down in Dark Souls 2 are reincarnations of Lordran's major players. In fact, the discovery of the continent where the game takes place was done for the sake of harvesting those reincarnated souls. It is quite possible, for instance, that Salden has reincarnated the soul of the crestfallen warrior from Lordran, and thus, his arc is a second chance for him to find happiness, and avoid succumbing to depression like his predecessor. Dark Souls 3 follows this development as well. Hilariously, Matthew claims that the character reappears thousands of years later for no reason. It's baffling how he excuses Dark Souls 1, a game entirely unrelated to Demon Souls, for reusing character archetypes, yet he bashes Dark Souls 2 for reusing those present in Dark Souls 1, when, this time, there's an actual reason in the story for it. It's yet another arbitrary, incoherent argument he lazily wrote to justify his biased ranting.
The worlds of Demon Souls and Dark Souls were brilliantly realised because they felt internally consistent. You have to suspend your disbelief about magic and all that, but once you do, the world behaves in sensical ways. When I played the Souls games, I walked around cautiously, taking in my surroundings, and when presented with a situation where I had to make a choice, I would usually try to make the one that would realistically pay off. This wasn't solely because of the punishing difficulty of those games, it was because the world made sense, felt fair, and was totally engrossing. Dark Souls 2 simply doesn't have the same attention to detail as the previous games in this regard. The world doesn't fit together either logically or thematically. In Harvest Valley you can get a clear view of Earthen Peak and see the surrounding area. After beating the Earthen Peak boss, you then get in an elevator and go straight up about 15 more floors, arriving at Iron Keep. There's no hint of Iron Keep whatsoever from the outside of Earthen Peak. From Harvest Valley the sky is overcast, but in Iron Keep it has a red glow and the surrounding area is suddenly an enormous wasteland of lava. Similar transitions exist elsewhere. Going from the Tower of Flame down to No Man's Wharf makes no sense, as this places the wharf somewhere below sea level. Going to the boss in Aldia's Keep reveals the landscape to be far below, but in reality the player should be more or less at the same altitude as Majula here, since they've only walked up a few stairs. Even worse then, transitioning to the Dragon Eyrie reveals an obviously impossible set of outcrops in the sky which weren't visible just moments before.
Then he rants that the world of Demon Souls is internally cohesive, while Dark Souls 2's is not, which, again, misses the point. As explained before, Dark Souls 2 takes place in a dream world, inspired by stories such as Alice in Wonderland, which is referenced multiple times, and the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadaf, which has also been amply referenced in the series, and also in games like Bloodborne. Dark Souls 1 and 3 feature some illogical scenarios as well, but in lesser quantity, and that is not in spite of internal coherence, but precisely because of it. Time and space are convoluted in the world of Dark Souls. This is not a cop-out either, but a carefully thought-out characteristic of the world, with powerful implications for its story, which I talk about in other videos. Dark Souls 2's attention to detail is astounding. Again, I have to direct you to my 3-hour-long video which talks about it in detail, as I don't want to make this video even longer by providing elaborate explanations and analysis of each character and area. I will, however, provide some examples of the phenomenon, which Matthew believes to be an unintentional flaw in Demon Souls, also a game whose world has a dreamlike character to it, though to a lesser degree, in Dark Souls 1. In Dark Souls 1, the Archtree whose inside is a Great Hollow makes no logical sense. As we reach the Ash Lake, we can see that it is, essentially, one tree stacked on top of each other. We can't see the demon ruins, nor Nito's catacombs and the Tomb of Giants from the Ash Lake, which also makes no sense. In truth, when we travel downwards through the hollow, we are traveling through time and space simultaneously, and the Ash Lake is like an isolated dimension from a different timeline, like the kiln of the first flame at the end of the game, or the painted world of Ariamis, which is simply a painted memory of the ruins of Karim, which was a province within the world of man, that is, within the upper walls of Anorlondo. In Demon Souls, it makes no logical sense for the beach with the ruins of Murs to exist below the Nexus. In truth, it operates under the same magical logic as the kiln and similar areas in Dark Souls. It is a chunk of the world that was removed and confined to a pocket dimension of sorts. If you believe, like the rest of the internet mob who can't think for themselves, that the transition between the Earthen Peak and the Iron Keep is a mistake, you must also believe that the transition between Majula and Hyde's Tower of Flame is one as well, as the tunnel we've just walked through has sunk into deep water, and there seems to be no way out from within the area. And if you are stupid and arrogant enough to believe that, you must also think, like Matthew, that the developers of the game would have made the same mistake for the hub area of the game by modeling the ruins of Hyde, as seen in Majula, accidentally. Which leads us to Matthew's next argument.
There's a host of smaller issues as well, such as the Tower of Flame as seen from Majula, which is way out of position. As a result, the feel of Dark Souls 2 suffers heavily compared to the other games, which felt much more consistent in their geography.
In a comic display of ignorance, Matthew says the ruined vestige of the Tower of Flame, as seen from Majula, is way out of position, when it is not just out of position, it's almost entirely sunken in the water, and there is no bridge connecting it to the village. I'm sure the developers must be drooling morons, and it's not Matthew who's at fault for not seeing the obvious here. Imagine this guy reading Lovecraft and ranting about how the Mountains of Madness makes no logical sense.
Even worse than any of this is the Shrine of Winter, which makes sense physically, but not logically. The player is expected to kill the 4 old ones or amass 1,000,000 souls before this will open, and all it does is circumvent a pile of rubble. A small pile of rubble blocks the way in the forest, so rather than climb over it, the character kills 4 of the most powerful beings in existence. I understand why they wanted Drangley Castle gated off until later, but this ridiculously poor level design shattered my suspension of disbelief so hard it never recovered.
His next complaint can be similarly debunked. The Shrine of Winter isn't merely circumventing a pile of rubble. It is essentially opening a portal to another dimension, like its Dark Souls 1 equivalent, the Emerald Gate which opens the path to the kiln, once you've defeated the 4 great beings of that game. Locations in Dark Souls are fixed to specific times of day, and that is by design. In Dark Souls 1, the journey of our protagonist is, seemingly, from a cloudy, pre-twilight sky to increasingly sunny ones, as it appears when we finally arrive at Anorlondo, the city of the sun, the city of the gods. But what's happening instead is our protagonist is journeying towards the night, and the sun of Anorlondo is but an illusion. The sky of the Undead Asylum was, in fact, a new dawn, and not a day's end. Velka, the character associated with the east, the cardinal direction of the sunset, and the moon, orchestrated an elaborate plot to usurp Gwyn, the character associated with the west, the cardinal direction of the sunrise, and the sun, and the undead are pawns of her scheme, which ultimately aims to undo the curse of undead, but while bringing forth the night in the process. In Dark Souls 2, the opposite happens. We go from a sunset sky to one with a large, gleaming sun shining above, though it is hidden by dark clouds, looking like a moon instead, a scene perfectly symbolic of Nashendra's hidden conspiracy, which restores the time of day, inversely paralleling Valka's, which called upon the night, and disguised the moon as the sun. The various monarchs who should have linked to the fire abandoned their duties, and stagnation and death brought back Gwyn's son. Our protagonist must break this chain of darkness and fulfill the role which his predecessors left behind.
It might have died in Aldia's Keep anyway, where a bunch of creatures sit around in cages they're easily capable of demolishing.
The ogres didn't break their cages because they were hollowed creatures, like your average hollow enemy, with a visible dark sign on their bodies.
There were plenty of other weird, grating decisions made in other areas too. If you die to the Lost Sinner, then decide to take a break when the loading screen comes up, you'll be killed by the archers at the bonfire over and over again, losing all your souls in the process. Just across the bridge from there, they also made the genius decision to place an important vendor in a room with 5 exploding enemies.
The following remarks about that bonfire at Sinner's Rise, which spawned you near a couple enemies, and that one in the Bastille near Strayed, were addressed in the Scholar edition of the game.
It's obvious that the level designers didn't have the same priorities when working on Dark Souls 2. I'd imagine the decision to allow warping right from the start of the game was made very early on in development, since every level is essentially a long tunnel leading to a dead end. I've seen some people compare this to the level design in Demon Souls, but honestly that is an insulting statement to make about that game. Even in Demon Souls, the levels were often designed to loop back around on themselves to provide shortcuts. They were usually presented in a very natural way which matched up with the style of the world. In Boletaria you unlock gates, in Stonefang you activate a lift, in Latria you open up locked doors. The level design in Dark Souls 2 is not only lazy because it provides an incoherent world compared to Dark Souls 1, but also because it has less interesting layouts than the levels in either of the previous games. The Tower of Flame is a small path with one short divergence leading to an optional boss. Aldia's Keep has a nice entryway, then turns into a single long corridor with a few small side rooms. Dranglake Castle is a series of narrow, nonsensical hallways. Contrast that with the Castle of Anor Londo, which was by no means perfect, but actually had some rooms to explore like a castle should.
He says that comparing Dark Souls 2's level design to Demon Souls is insulting for the latter, because one of them has more shortcuts, which, sure, I love as well, and makes more sense within the game's world, which, as discussed previously, is incorrect. While it is true that Dark Souls 2, especially the original version of the game, features some areas with no loop-arounds, Matthew completely disregards experimental and interesting gimmicks as well as other forms of progress outside of physical shortcuts. For instance, High's Tower of Flame has 2 gimmicks, one related to its enemies and the other to its level design. The golems are, essentially, judges of strength, and were programmed to test the skills of the people who wish to link the fire. They challenge the player to curated battles, which they were instructed to perform. Dark Souls 2 experiments a lot with enemy AI, and there are many instances of interesting, unique behaviors that enhance the personalities of the mobs. In this case, the Tower of Flame is designed as an introductory challenge to new players, just as in Universe it was designed as a challenge to foreigners who came to the New World and had to prove themselves to be ordained Knights of the Blue. As a brief aside, the Scholar version added a few of these knights to the area, and they punish the player from deviating from the trial by going straight to the No Man's Wharf. In their hollowed minds, they're punishing cowards for chickening out. Throughout the level, there are 2 levers which the player can pull to facilitate one of its boss fights, which only appear once the player has dueled certain golems, rewarding progress and exploration. Experienced players can choose to skip them and even use the missing platforms to their advantage. Matthew ignores both of these mechanics and reduces the level to a small path with one short divergence, leading to an optional boss. Aldia's Keep was reworked in the Scholar edition, and is now a fascinating area, though it was already interesting before, and had many interesting revelations about the plot and lore of the game. It featured Navlan, one of the most memorable NPCs in the series, whose questline is very creatively designed, can deeply impact the game, and is a callback to Mephistopheles from Demon Souls. A secret area, which requires you to free an ogre and make it break a wall. A room filled with corrosive acids that made the player leave his comfort zone by unequipping his gear to explore it. A room adorned with dark mirrors from which knights spawn. Bizarre scholars who hid behind the paintings on the walls. A death dragon that comes back to life, and more. The player must also be careful that the enemies do not break the cages of other enemies. In the scholar version of the area, there is also a memorable encounter with the Forlorn NPC, which reveals his true nature as a scientific experiment of Aldia, a failed attempt at circumventing the curse by separating the soul from the body, which resulted in a nameless vengeful ghost, who's sentenced to forever hunt for a body, which it can't even possess. The only bonfire within the keep is hidden behind a secret wall, and the main hallway is quite dark unless you activate a Pharaoh's lock, which beautifully lights it up. The entire area is themed around dark, failed scientific experiments, and artificial life forms. It's quite unique, even when contrasted with the incredibly creative catalogue of places created by From Software. Though it felt a bit lacking in the original version, it doesn't in Scholar. Matthew still presented it shabbily on purpose, omitting its quirks and nuances. There is not a single area in Dark Souls 2 that features no shortcuts or interesting gimmicks that are comparable to those of Demon Souls locations. Not a single one. The two examples of so-called lazily designed, boring areas provided by Matthew are, arguably, the least interesting areas in the game, one of them being an introductory map, and they are still full of character. The reductionistic, hyperbolic way Matthew talks about the areas of Dark Souls 2 is really unfair. I will, begrudgingly, do the same for Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 to show just how meaningless this form of argumentation is. One Tubuletaria castle is just a straight path to a boss fight, with a divergence that leads to a merchant, which you've already seen before, only this time he sells you a couple new items. There are no new enemies in this zone, all of them appeared in 1.1. Of course, there's a dragon shooting fire at the bridge, which makes this area more interesting, and completely recontextualizes exploration and traversal. But it's questionable if Matthew would even mention this if the area came from Dark Souls 2, given how he ignores unique encounters, themes and gimmicks that make the areas interesting when talking about them. The entirety of the Shrine of Storm's Arkstone has no shortcuts and features many corridor-like paths with enemies. As a reminder, the Shrine of Storms consists of almost 20% of the game. The Ash Lake is nonsensically designed, as it doesn't seem to logically fit in with the world around it, and consists of a mostly empty stretch of ash sand. It wastes the player's time by making him walk pointlessly, and traps him there unless he's got the Lord Vessel. The kiln of the First Flame is also nonsensically designed. It makes no sense for you to go through a door and end up in a different place of space-time. It isn't like this is a fantastical world, with its own laws of reality and magic, which the second game also abides to, cohesively. And is just a series of straight lines with boring one-on-one encounters with reused mobs. See how utterly stupid I sound? Still unconvinced? Let me quickly describe a painting this way. The Mona Lisa is just a series of brushstrokes on a wood panel, which form a portrait of a regular-looking woman. Drangleic Castle is strangely configured for a reason. It is not a regular castle. It is more like Sun's Fortress than Anor Londo, as it is filled with traps, golems, and puzzles, which the protagonist must overcome in order to prove his worth. Its design as a castle is mostly symbolic. The thrones it features belongs to a king and a queen, who constructed it to test the next generations of courageous undead who wants to link the fire, and once they finish setting it up, they last to guard the throne of ash at its end and serve as the final trial to those undead. The castle was later occupied by Vendrick, who renamed it after his kingdom, and created, alongside his brother, the Looking Glass Knight, as well as additional challenges to the undead who wished to serve him as knights, before he himself would link the fire. Later in his life, as he fell prey to temptation, he reformed it and subverted its original purpose. The castle became not a trial of strength, but a symbol of dark stagnation which Nashandra had brought with her. A useless sculpture of pure gold was commissioned and placed near the queen's improvised throne room. I could go on, but the point is that, once again, there are obvious reasons for the layout of the area being the way it is, and the developers were not stupid simply because Matthew fails to grasp them.
The only shortcut I can even remember from Dark Souls 2 is kicking over a tree in Huntsman's Copse, which turns out to be totally unnecessary anyway since there's a bonfire placed right next to it.
Next, he mentions how the only shortcut he remembers finding in Dark Souls 2 is a useless one in Huntsman's Copse. He is correct in pointing out that the shortcut feels pointless. but he is either extremely disingenuous by saying he remembers it as the only one in the game, or he is utterly incompetent at exploring, or perhaps a mixture of the two alternatives is true. In the things betwixt, there's a shortcut that leads the player from the crow's nest at the end of the first section to the main corridor. This shortcut remains useful throughout the game, as the player can trade items with Dinah and Tylo, and the rewards are generally more useful than those of the first game. There's another shortcut that takes you directly to the magic coffin. In the Forest of the Fallen Giants, the first real area of the game, there are two shortcuts. One of them is unlocked by breaking a visibly cracked wall of the Cardinal Tower, and another is unlocked by going through the entire level and opening a door from behind. This shortcut is very useful as it shortens your journey to two different boss fights, the Last Giant and the Pursuer. Granted, this next one did not exist in the original version of the game, so it is unfair to point it out in response to Matthew, but in the Scholar Edition, you can kick a bridge in No Man's Wharf that circumvents nearly the entire area and takes you right to the ship where the Flexile Sentry is. There's also a shortcut near the Gavlan NPC, though its main use is to get to the NPC. The bell which calls the ship also serves as a distinct marker of progress. In the Lost Bastille, there are two main shortcuts, one of which takes you to the Ruin Sentinels, and the other connects the area from the Exile holding cells to the rest of the Bastille. I could go on, but the point is that Dark Souls 2 is full of shortcuts. Proportionally speaking, it isn't too dissimilar to the previous two games, and, like them, its areas often feature unique gimmicks that serve as alternative markers of progress, such as the torches you can light in the gutter, which make it significantly easier to navigate the darkness and tell you where you've already went to, guiding your subsequent runs through the area. Some areas are more open-ended and feature looping paths and multiple secret rooms, rewarding careful exploration. Experimental gimmicks that are equivalents to shortcuts are abundant in the DLCs, which hadn't yet been released when Matthew made his video, but their areas are considered among the best designed by From Software for their creative and experimental mechanics and layouts.
It's not just the level-by-level design which suffers in Dark Souls 2 compared to other installments, it's the accessibility of different areas and the placement of many items too. This is another reason why comparisons between the design of Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2 are insulting to the former. In Demon Souls, once the player finished the first stage of Boletaria, they then had 5 levels immediately available for them at any point. Each level had different pros and cons. There were incentives to go to any of them, except arguably the swamp, but even then the player isn't blocked from exploring the swamp if they wish. Item placement in Demon Souls was carefully balanced to give each world a reasonably fair share of useful items which players would eventually be aware of for subsequent playthroughs. Dark Souls 1 attempted to carry on this legacy but did a somewhat worse job. There were several areas available right from the start, but not as much incentive to go to them. That said, the placement of items was still pretty well considered, and some players might opt to go straight through the Catacombs or Blighttown at the start to acquire certain items. In Dark Souls 2, Majula only opens into 2 locations at the beginning, but the sad thing is it actually connects to 5. The Grave of Saints, Huntsman's Copse and Shaded Woods are all sealed off until the player completes at least some of the other areas, or gathers up around 12,000 souls to buy the Cat Ring. There's no good reason why this should be the case, other than trying to ensure inexperienced players end up starting on the right path. That might seem like a harmless compromise to make, but the Souls games are supposed to be a refuge from the crippling accessibility concessions many other modern games make. Dark Souls 2 doesn't seem to have as much trust in the player, so it's frustrating that these areas, and the items they contain, are locked away until later for no good reason.
Matthew's next argument feels so detached from the actual gameplay experience of most players, that it comes across as if it were crafted solely for viewers who haven't played Dark Souls 2. He juxtaposes Demon Souls' lack of linearity to Dark Souls 2's, and claims that, since 3 out of the 5 areas that connect to Majula require the player to, essentially, kill a single boss, yes, 1 out of 32 of the game's bosses, comparisons between the two games are insulting to the former. This argument is beyond ridiculous. He even claims to understand the reason for this decision, which is to ensure inexperienced players end up doing an easier area as their first. The thing is, Demon Souls did the exact same thing. You can only do 1-1 as your first area. The game only opens up once you kill the Phalanx, not counting the optional tutorial. How is that any different to Dark Souls 2's way of handling accessibility? Matthew doesn't explain how, because he can't. If anything, Demon Souls is more handholdy, because when you talk to the first NPC you meet, a cutscene that directs you to the first mandatory area plays out. Dark Souls 2 enables you to force your way through the Shrine of Winter, the magic gate that takes you to the game's second half, by collecting 1 million soul memory. There are 9 options for your first boss in Dark Souls 2, 10 if you count the DLCs. You are free to choose the Twin Dragon Riders as your first boss. You can fight the Dark Lurker as your first boss. In Demon Souls, you can never fight, say, the Flame Lurker or the Penetrator as your first boss. It will always be either Vanguard, the tutorial boss, or Phalanx. Then, you are only able to kill the Tower Knight or one of the bosses of the first Arcstone of an area. Dark Souls 2 is more open-ended than Demon Souls, and by a mile, especially if you count the DLCs.
This has an adverse effect on multiple playthroughs of the game since they all start out the same way. The layout of Demon Souls, and to a lesser extent Dark Souls 1, allowed you to start a new game and quickly build whatever character you liked. Instead of carrying on this tradition, Dark Souls 2 railroads the player at the beginning and only opens up more later on. There's a serious lack of useful equipment in the first half of the game, which becomes doubly problematic since players are going to waste Titanite and souls on weapons they're not very attached to, simply because they don't have any other options. The Ember needed to ascend weapons is tucked all the way away in Iron Keep, which means at the very least going through the Tower of Flame, Huntsman's Copse, Harvest Valley and Earthen Peak just to snag the Ember, never mind the other materials you might want for your weapon. The majority of Twinkling Titanite needed for special upgrades is only available once the player gets to Dranglake Castle, at which point they're most of the way through the game anyway.
He then goes on to basically complain about Dark Souls 2's worse replayability and build variety in the first half of the game, which is laughable to veteran players of the series, as it is universally agreed among them that Dark Souls 2 is the title with the richest build variety, even in its first half. The cost of leveling decreased, which means that players have more freedom to mold their builds from early on, and there are many weapons and spells that fill niche stat investments placed mostly at the game's second half, which experienced players build towards in further playthroughs. Matthew proceeds to claim that the players will waste valuable Titanite and souls on useless weapons, which is even more nonsensical than his other nitpicks, since Dark Souls 2 is the most general Souls game when it comes to upgrade materials. You can buy 10 Titanite shards from a Julius blacksmith. You can find them everywhere in the game's first half, as well as easily farm them as soon as you reach the Harvest Valley, and if you choose to clear the Iron Keep, you've got an infinite supply of them through Cloane. In the original version, you can also guess the Dual Ember as the Iron Keep, which grants you unlimited access to large Titanite shards. In the Scholar edition, you can find the Ember even sooner as the Lost Bastille. His complaints about the placement of Twinkling Titanites can also be applied to Dark Souls 1. Also, many early game weapons such as the Mace and the Rapier are some of the best in the entire game and are amply used by speedrunners and challenge runners.
The overabundance of bonfires is another issue with the overall level design in Dark Souls 2. One of the greatest things about Dark Souls 1 compared to Demon Souls was its careful bonfire placement, which engaged the player in a game of risk versus reward. If you got far into a new area, you could usually make your way back to the previous bonfire easily to use your souls for leveling up, but that would waste more time than pressing onwards, so you were left with a dilemma: push yourself to go on, or go back and play it safe. This could lead to some very tense situations with a lot of souls on the line, and personally I can recall at least a few occasions on my first playthrough where the relief of finding a new bonfire was immense. That same feeling is hard to reclaim in Dark Souls 2 when all the bonfires are so close to one another. Not only this, but the way health in general is handled in Dark Souls 2 removes even more of the tension from the first game. In Demon Souls, players could farm healing grass off the enemies in Boletaria and carry around more than they would ever need. So in Dark Souls, the Estus system was introduced to stop this kind of healing abuse. The regeneration ring was also removed, meaning the only ways to heal were to use Estus, engage in combat successfully with the Ring of the Evil Eye, use up a humanity, or learn a miracle. This was one of the most fundamental and greatest improvements going from Demon Souls to Dark Souls, made for the very clear purpose of forcing players to take their health seriously. Even now, after playing Dark Souls 2 several times, I can't believe the new directors backtracked on this extremely important and well-reasoned change. It seems to me like they didn't understand the significance of healing in Dark Souls, in which case they should never have been placed in charge of this game. Dark Souls 2 adds in consumable healing items and a regeneration ring placed in a prominent location early on, which can be easily equipped on any build since there's 2 additional ring slots. In Dark Souls 1, a player on half health would have to consider carefully whether or not to use one of their flasks now, or wait until they sustained more damage in order to maximise its usefulness. This is a subtle gameplay mechanic, but one which adds a very welcome layer of decision making to healing and increases the tension of exploring. In Dark Souls 2 this has been stripped out. Damage at half health will heal gradually with the regeneration ring, and even if you run out of Estus you can always fall back to other items.
His next argument is somewhat valid. The healing system is more forgiving in Dark Souls 2, and bonfires are more abundant. However, the argument contradicts one of the major points of Matthew's critique, which is that the developers wanted to make the game hard for difficulty's sake. And the new healing mechanics also have their pros. In Dark Souls 1, you could exploit the healing system by acquiring a few humanities, which, as soon as you kill Pinwheel, enable you to get 20 Estus at any bonfire. If you did that, you could face tank your way through the entire game effortlessly, as healing was instantaneous once you drank them, and with enough poise, you could get away with mashing square at any time. Even with 10 Estus at every bonfire, the strategy is still viable and trivializes the game. Just kindle the bonfire and equip the heaviest armor you have, and you can destroy even bosses like the 4 Kings with ease. Whenever I play Dark Souls 1, I purposely avoid kindling bonfires beyond the first upgrade, and equipping heavy armor for this reason. In Dark Souls 2, the player increases his supply of Estus as he explores the game, which, coupled with the slower repletion of HP, fixes that issue. To avoid nerfing the player too much, life gems were created as a band-aid solution. However, it does not cheese the game as one might think, since combat is quite slow-paced. Their use animation is fairly slow at first, the rate of HP repletion is even slower than that of the Estus, and more enemies and bosses were given attacks designed to punish careless healing. In fact, Matthew wouldn't have complained about the difficulty so much if life gems simply negated it. As expected, Matthew's reaction to this change is to basically call the game developers idiots. Funnily enough, he portrays the Ring of Restoration as this overpowered, game-breaking item, when, in reality, most players barely notice it once equipped, and ditch it as soon as they get better rings. If you were able to guess the Sanctus Shield in Dark Souls 1's early game, would it trivialize the healing mechanic? I don't think so.
After failing to maintain the major healing revamp from Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 attempts to make a major change of its own when it comes to light sources, and fails at this as well. I played Dark Souls 2 on the lowest darkness settings available, but none of the areas were ever as dark as the Tomb of the Giants in Dark Souls 1. On paper it's an interesting idea, asking players to forgo a shield in order to light the surrounding area, but it seems, at some point in development, possibly not long before release, the designers backpedaled on the torch system. The few areas where the torch came in handy were a nice change of pace. It would have been interesting to see a few more of these.
Matthew then validly points out that it would have been nice if the game featured more areas as dark as the gutter. I agree. The torch mechanic in general has to be downgraded because of unfortunate technical circumstances. Had Dark Souls 2 been initially released on the PS4 and not the PS3, the developers would have been able to implement it as it worked in the demo, which suffered from heavy stuttering and low frame rates. However, the torch is still quite impactful in a handful of areas of the game.
For every good gameplay change in Dark Souls 2 there's at least one step back. It's great that you can use multiple souls at once in the menu, but it's idiotic that the rewards from the crows are randomized.
He then complains about the randomized drops of the crows, which is such a minor, subjective nitpick, and misses the point of this change. The crow in Dark Souls 1 only had niche uses. The few intuitive trades it had could not be repeated. In Dark Souls 2, the player can acquire a variety of upgrades by trading with the crows, and the trades can be repeated, and work as a way of rewarding exploration. Perhaps Matthew wouldn't have complained about the lack of upgrade materials in the game's first half, if he had simply explored and traded more with the crows instead of judging the mechanic as idiotic for no reason. If you happen to get an uncommon weapon from them, it's a bonus that may spice up your playthrough. This reworked trade mechanic increases replayability.
It's nice that the different rolling speeds aren't in 4 obvious tiers, but the addition of agility messes up rolling in general. With the amount of tracking the enemies in this game have, invincibility frames are an absolute must for the rolling to be useful, but the number of invincible frames depends on the amount of agility, so you're never quite sure at what point in your roll you'll be vulnerable. I'm willing to admit, on paper, this makes for a slightly deeper combat system than the previous games, but in practice it makes rolling less consistent and more frustrating.
Then, he claims that the agility stat messes up the rolling mechanic, which is blatantly false. To be blunt, the agility stat is mostly hated by scrubs, and by people who can't form opinions of their own and take their views from YouTubers like Matthew himself. The rolling mechanic of Dark Souls 2 is by far the most complex and interesting ever designed by From Software. First, they innovated by expanding the spectrum of movement and speed, dynamically tying it to the equip load percentage of your character. This is such a massive change that completely rebalances the equip load system, enabling a nigh infinite number of viable, efficient build setups, yet Matthew brushes it off with a simple remark about it being a positive of the game. In every previous and subsequent game created by From Software, it is pointless to not load your character with the heaviest possible gear you can wear without reaching an arbitrary weight percentage. This means that most armor sets in the game are simply inefficient, and even if they look cool, or appropriate to your character, you have nothing to gain, gameplay-wise, by wearing them in place of your min-maxed gear. It felt so novel to have full control over a roll animation in Dark Souls 2, yet the mechanic would never be implemented again. The agility stat complemented this increase in build versatility, as experienced players could choose to skip it entirely, spending their souls on other stats, while relying more on their spacing and timing skills, or perhaps they could level it up just enough to reach their preferred soft cap for maximum comfort. Once you level agility to 100, your roll is about as strong as a light roll from Dark Souls 1. Newbies could increase this to get a dodge roll as strong as the ninja flip of the previous game. How is this a bad thing? If you are so bothered by starting off with a roll inferior to Dark Souls 1's light roll, you can simply invest most of the souls of 2 boss kills into ADP and be done with it for the rest of your playthrough. By starting with the Explorer class and killing your first boss, you already have more than enough souls to turn your roll into a stronger version of Dark Souls 1's light roll. The resistance stat was totally useless in Dark Souls 1, and in Dark Souls 2, it was reworked to add more complexity, skill expression, and build variety to the game, and it succeeded in doing so. Unfortunately, agility would never come back, possibly due to its demonizing by the online mob mentality. Thinking rationally, it's easy to see how Dark Souls 3 would have benefited from its inclusion. It's also worth mentioning that the stat increases the speed of multiple animations, such as that of the Estus Flask and blocking. Matthew also never acknowledges the rework of the stamina mechanic, which also enriches skill expression. Every attack and dodge roll you perform is dynamically reliant on your stamina bar. If it is mostly depleted, the action will come out slow and inefficient, punishing bad stamina management and vice versa.
Paradoxically, the animations lack the weight present in Dark Souls 1, but nearly every action is actually far more clunky this time around thanks to the agility stat, especially at the start. The best thing I can say about this is at least it means adaptability is more worthwhile than resistance was.
He then says that the animations are far more clunky this time around, when that is an entirely subjective opinion. I personally appreciate how a lot of care was put into the new weapon animations. Some great swords now have elegant, realistic movesets, and the character doesn't just slam the sword on the ground.
Soul memory is a decent idea, but executed incredibly poorly, making it worse than the simplistic level matching the previous games did. I like that they were at least trying to think of ways to stop twink characters from obliterating new players, but in doing so they made invasions even more rare, and now players can't do novelty builds just to play in certain areas because their soul memory will eventually get too high. The schizophrenic design of Dark Souls 2 seems to just change, fix and break things at random.
The soul memory mechanic succeeded in its intent exceptionally well. Invasions in Dark Souls 2 were far more balanced than those of Dark Souls 1 on average. Matthew's complaint about not being able to create thematic or area-specific builds was addressed in the Scholar edition of the game through the A-Gape ring, though you could easily use save backups to keep invading at a specific memory range. Again, Matthew insults the developers by calling the design of Dark Souls 2 random and schizophrenic, when the complete opposite is true. What is random and schizophrenic is his critique of the game. Having said that, his next point is partially valid.
The schizophrenic design of Dark Souls 2 seems to just change, fix and break things at random. To me, this is all summed up with one minor problem with the Emerald Herald which irritated me to no end. When leveling up in Demon Souls, the Maiden in Black would recite a sort of incantation about souls, Anyone who's played the game for any decent length of time can probably repeat it word for word. The phrase, she says, appears when the player enters the level up screen, and as they think about their stats, it continues to play in the background. The Emerald Herald has a somewhat similar phrase, which she recites, but it's all front-loaded before the menu instead of playing in the background. Forcing players to get through 4 sentences before they can level up is only going to build resentment towards a character they're clearly supposed to like. The bigger problem though, is that this issue was already solved, and yet for some reason it's now implemented in a much worse manner. The way the Maiden in Black recites her incantation is a very elegant solution which had no reason to be changed. It's like the team behind Dark Souls 2 tried to mimic Demon Souls without even bothering to go back and play it.
He complains that the Emerald Herald greets the player with dialogue that he'll certainly skip again and again, which is a bit annoying indeed, though he equates these lines with those of the Maiden in Black's leveling ritual. The former invites the player to set forth on their journey, while the latter is a magic ritual of soul absorption.
While I'm talking about incomprehensible changes, I just can't avoid mentioning the small tweak they made to boss introductions. This little bloody screen thing that pulses at the start of these cutscenes is incredibly dumb. I have no other words for it. All I can do is point out the absurdity of it. Again, my problem here isn't that I dislike it. I realise it's a very small issue. The real problem is that it was completely fine in the previous games, but got changed for absolutely no reason. When you stop and think about it, it says a lot about the way this game was designed. Nobody was looking for this kind of effect to be added to the cutscenes, but some people like myself would surely dislike it. They only stood to lose out by adding it, and yet they added it anyway, because they just weren't thinking.
I also agree that the blood effect is a bad inclusion. I remember using a mouse to remove it from the game back then. However, he extrapolates this minor stylistic change to mean every single decision made by the new developers, every experimental mechanic, every innovation and improvement was misguided, because they simply weren't thinking.
If you had asked me before Dark Souls 2 released, knowing that Miyazaki had been replaced in his role as the director, what would be the most likely thing to be fixed in the next game, I'd have guessed the Covenant system. Turns out I would have been wrong. The most obviously half-finished area of Dark Souls 1 remains half-finished in Dark Souls 2, despite there being clear avenues for improvement. The Souls games have, for the most part, valued smart decisions out of players not just with regards to combat but also in NPC interactions and other choices. I mean, if I came up to you on the street and asked you to join my organisation without explaining what it was, it would be a bad idea to accept my proposal. This is such a simple piece of logic, it's one of the earliest things we teach children. This was my chief problem with the Covenants in Dark Souls 1, and nothing has been done to correct it in Dark Souls 2. Take the Company of Champions for example. The player walks up to a big stone tablet and is immediately prompted to join the Covenant without any explanation. This could have easily had some text on the tablet explaining what the Covenant was about. Instead, you only get a vague description after you accept the first prompt.
The Covenant system of Dark Souls 2 is a clear step up from the first game, with one sole exception. His first complaint about the system is that the game doesn't tell you what the Covenants are. He cites as an example the Victor Stone, which prompts you to join a Covenant with no explanation, once again proving to not have paid any attention to the game. In Majula, there's an NPC whose purpose includes delivering information to the player. Shauquar, a know-it-all talking cat, who's based on the Cheshire Cat of Alice in Wonderland. If he'd simply listened to her dialogue instead of skipping or ignoring it, he would have known what the Company of Champions Covenants was about, as she explains it. I personally think most Covenants are quite intuitively understandable even before joining them. The Brotherhood of Blood is a PvP-focused Covenant, as its name obviously implies. The Covenant leader is also standing just beside the PvP arenas. The Bellkeeper's Covenant is also easy to understand, as its name too is self-explanatory, and the NPC quite plainly tells the player its purpose, which is to protect the bells. The Way of Blue is explained by Salden, its Covenant leader. The Red Covenant is also easy to grasp, and the Red King explains it to you directly. The Company of Champions is properly introduced to you by Shauquar. Then, we're left with only 3 Covenants, 2 of which were present in Dark Souls 1, and work the same, simple way, and one of which is tied to the game's hidden boss, and is, in universe, the most taboo of them all, justifying its secrecy.
I go into the Souls games knowing as little about them as possible, which I definitely feel is the way they should be played, so for all I knew I might suffer some harsh penalty for abandoning this Covenant, which meant it would be foolish for me to join it without having more information. The same applies to half the other Covenants in the game. Now, as I said, this was an issue with Dark Souls 1, I'm not going to ignore that, but the chief benefit of doing a direct sequel like Dark Souls 2 is the ability to fix up areas from the first game, which hasn't happened here. Eventually I would find out there are no consequences for abandoning any of the covenants, which is another problem. The word covenant has an air of permanence to it which isn't upheld by the game at all. Again, this problem existed in Dark Souls 1, but if anything, Dark Souls 2 practically encourages the player to abandon covenants whenever it seems even mildly convenient to do so, since they can always easily rejoin. If you're going through one of the bell towers, you may as well just join the bell covenant to get a few Titanite chunks. If you want to go through the doors of Pharos without any hassle, just go back and join the rat covenant. I feel like the covenants needed permanency, either by limiting them to one per character, or at least enforcing a strict penalty for abandonment. This would have improved the replayability of the game by giving each character a certain role in the world, and might have improved the longevity of the online as well by giving people a stronger attachment to their covenant.
He then complains about the lack of punishment for abandoning a covenant. While I agree that some kind of punishment would have been a good thing, his proposed solution presents way more problems than it solves. By locking players to one covenant, it would make it so they must create a new character to acquire the rewards of a different covenant, which would be awful for people who want to get every spell and weapon in the game for their character. The players would also be heavily disincentivized from joining the least conventional covenants, with the least useful rewards for their character, which would kill activity and variety. Perhaps the Belfries would still see a lot of invasions, but the Doors of Pharos and the Grave of Saints would likely be killed off, and so on. This permanent system would also make it less interesting for a player who wants to engage with the online organically as he goes through the game. The Belfry Covenant is really useful if a player wants to upgrade a new weapon to diversify or change his build, but it is totally useless if they don't want to engage in invasions, or if they have no need for Titanites. If you're a cleric, you definitely want to join the Heirs of Sunlight, as it holds the game's strongest miracle. But if you're locked to it, you won't be able to get the Wrath of the Gods from the Blue Sentinels, and your build won't ever be fully completed, at least not until New Game++.
As for the covenants themselves, there are some other, more specific issues. One minor detail which has a drastic knock-on effect is the lack of a whole red-eye orb for invaders. Without whole orbs, there are less invasions overall. This means the Way of Blue Covenant will have fewer disciples, which means the Blue Sentinels have no reason to be summoned.
His next point is about a core issue I personally have with Dark Souls 2. Yes, the lack of a red-eye orb is awful for invaders like me, but I can see why it was done. The developers likely wanted to disincentivize people from invading just for invading's sake, and not to reap the rewards from the mechanic organically, which was definitely a blunder in their part, as the invasion system is the greatest PvP mechanic of any game to date by my standards.
The Rat Covenant is a completely unfair and frustrating setup to go against. In the Doors of Pharos, players are immediately assaulted by a huge mammoth creature, a toxin-inflicting rat, and an enemy player, all while wading around in knee-deep water which restricts movement. This isn't a PvP exchange, it's a meat grinder designed for the amusement of the rat. Some people defend this by saying the victim loses nothing in the engagement even if they die, but this is a weak excuse. Being pulled out of a level into a load screen only to be slaughtered by impossible odds, taunted by an enemy player and then kicked back into a load screen is a waste of time at best. Invasions have always tilted the scales in the favour of the invader, but this is going way too far.
Matthew then overblows the overpowered nature of the Rat Covenant. As he points out himself, the trespassing player loses nothing in the exchange. He's just discouraged from exploring the area, just as the Rat King wants. This is an ingenious in-universe mechanism, because the original pact man had made with the Rat King was designed to prevent the curse from spreading. Man gave to the rats domain over the underworld, and the rats would bite and eat the fallen undead that were transported to the Grave of Saints to petrify their bodies and prevent their souls from spreading to the surface, and them from rising from the dead as hollows. The Rat Covenant is a second go at this pact, with men helping the rats keep their domain safe from trespassers, while preventing the curse from spreading through death. Thus, why the only damage that is inflicted upon the trespasser is psychological. Despite the inherent advantage of the rat servants, the encounter can still be really fun. I know I have had a lot of fun both as the rat and the trespasser. This covenant has become a fan favorite, and for good reason. It is such an interesting mechanic to have the player be integrated into the area itself, enacting the role of a mini-boss, building his own maze of traps, and fighting alongside enemy creatures against other players. But of course, Matthew finds reasons to complain about it.
Fairness is something which is lacking a bit in Dark Souls 2 compared to previous installments. On the whole, it plays like the other two games, but there's less care taken to ensure each death is the fault of the player. For example, there's no way to know this door in Huntsman's Copse will get you attacked if you try to open it.
That hollow begins to break the door before the player even gets to open it. Even if the player had already started to open the door, Dark Souls 2 enables him to cancel the animation to roll away. When trying to get footage for this part, I accidentally avoided the ambush twice. And even if the player gets fully comboed by the bandit, well, is it a big deal? That enemy is really weak. If anything, that encounter should serve as a reminder for the player to stay alert to their surroundings, with a small scare as the price for letting their guards down.
There's no way to know this beam in the well will break if you land on it, especially unexpected since landing safely on stuff like this was possible in Demon Souls.
That wooden beam definitely looks breakable, unlike similar platforms in Dark Souls 1 that killed you if you tried to land on them. It also looks a bit too small for the player to land on.
This door in Aldia's Keep has no indication it's about to kill you either. This moment would be incredibly cheap in any game, but it's especially disheartening to see it in a Souls game which used to be known for being punishing, but fair.
The last gate at Aldia's Keep is foreshadowed by previous encounters with ogres, that can do the exact same thing to the metal gates that have gaps on them. The player is expected to be careful around these gates.
The worst offender of all is probably the windmill in Earthen Peak, which needs to be burned down in order to clear the boss room of poison. I have no idea how anyone is supposed to discover this without being told to do it by reading notes left by other players. The part the character sets on fire is clearly made of metal, and the level design here makes no attempt whatsoever to get players to light their torch. I suppose the saving grace here is that it's still possible to beat the boss even with the poison, but the point is none of it makes any sense.
The Windmill of Earthen Peak is the least intuitive out of these events, though the Scholar Edition did provide a couple more clues. As for how the mechanic works in universe, it's because of the magical nature of the world of Dark Souls, and I don't mean that abstractly. Stone, from which metals and matter in general derive in Dark Souls, turns to wood over time. We are explicitly told this in a couple item descriptions, and the idea is also communicated visually all throughout Dark Souls 2. The giants, made with titanite, have turned into wooden trees. The Ancient Dragon, which was created from the stone body of a dragon of the Age of Ancients, he is now brown and has vines going through his body. The Ancient Dragon from Dark Souls 1 is also wood-like in appearance, unlike his primordial ancestors who are made of stone. Thus, the once metallic support of the windmill has rusted and later turned into wood. Of course, the average player isn't expected to know all of this, so burning the windmill is more like a hidden mechanic that rewards experimentation. The more attentive players would look at Mipha's arena and think, where is all of this poisonous water coming from? This looks like a bath chamber, so perhaps there's a drainage system. And the arena is within a windmill structure. In the Scholar Edition, there's also an enemy suspiciously guarding the windmill. Those who learn of the secret could then leave messages alerting other players, and there's a bonfire right beside the windmill for you to light your torch. Either way, Mipha isn't a particularly difficult boss. I know I didn't struggle against her in my first playthrough, even though I did not burn the windmill.
Nobody reasonably expects a giant spider to shoot an enormous and incredibly damaging laser beam. It's simple to dodge once you know about it, but it can easily catch you off guard the first time because it's so nonsensical. Compare this with the armoured spider in Demon Souls, which can breathe fire. The level is a fiery mine, so you're probably expecting something fire-based.
Matthew hilariously claims nobody would expect a giant spider to shoot a magic beam from its mouth, only to compare it to the armor spider from Demon Souls, which shoots fire from its mouth. His justification for the latter is that the level is a fiery mine, so the player probably expects something fire-based, when Freya's level is filled with mages. The only reasoning he gives for Freya's laser beam being a problem is that it might catch you off guard the first time, as if that's an issue and not a surprise intended by the developers.
Another comparison is the Tower Knight and the Last Giant, which are night and day compared to one another. For the Tower Knight, the arena is incredibly spacious, and players are lured up to deal with the archers first, giving them time and space to learn the Tower Knight's attacks before having to deal with him directly. For the Last Giant, there's no such prep time, the arena is far more cramped, and his moveset consists of haphazard flailing which can catch you the wrong way for seemingly no reason. The Tower Knight fight is about as challenging as the Last Giant, the only difference being you're less likely to suffer a cheap death the first time you face him.
He compares the Tower Knight with the Last Giant, which is funny considering the Tower Knight has a much less intuitive attack than Freya's laser beam. He can shoot magic projectiles from his spear, something that wasn't foreshadowed at all beforehand, and can easily catch you off guard as you're killing the archers. He complains that the Last Giant's arena is more cramped than the Tower Knight's, which means nothing, really. The only similarity between these two bosses is their size. The Tower Knight requires a larger arena, because his fight hinges on him falling to the ground, so the player can hit his head, which is his weak point. Matthew's baseless rambling really seems to stem from the fact that he's bad at the game, and thinks it's the game's fault for it. Here's a clip of me killing the Last Giant with a base level character. See how easy it is to avoid his attacks. You don't even need to roll to avoid them most of the time. And the size of the arena is very comfortable. Hell, the arena of the Asylum Demon fight feels more claustrophobic than the Last Giant's because of all the pots. The Vanguard's arena is of a similar size to the Last Giant's, but his moveset is far more dangerous, and he can one-shot some of the classes.
It's not just bosses which suffer from these kind of problems. The mace-wielding knights in the Dragon area are perhaps the worst enemies in the entire series, thanks to how stupidly unfair their moveset is. They seem to just reset their animations constantly without any kind of stamina. Even after dropping their mace on the ground, they have no recovery time before they're swinging all over the place again. Trivial for a magic-wielding character, but insanely unfair for melee characters since there's no safe time to attack them.
Matthew says that the mace-wielding golems of the Dragon Shrine are the worst enemies in the series, thanks to how stupidly unfair their moveset is. He goes on to explain that they aren't restricted by stamina, as if other enemies are, and as if an automaton like it should be, and have little to no delay between their attacks. In truth, what's happening in the clip is that the golem is being overly aggressive to punish shield use. This area is designed as a trial of strength and bravery, like a late game version of Hyde's Tower of Flame. The golems were created not just to protect the shrine, but to test the undead in combat to determine if he's worthy of meeting the Ancient's Dragon. I will say, however, that the Scholar edition of the game massively improves that area, making this theme much easier to understand. There, it has become much more unique, as the Dragon Warriors watch you duel the golems and bow to you if you defeat them honorably, and attack you if you attempt to run away like a coward. It culminates in a duel against an actual Dragon Warrior, as two huge rows of them watch. Funnily enough, in the clip Matthew is showing, the golem robotically stops his onslaught and backs away as soon as it breaks the character's guard, as if to teach him to not use his shield against it.
This is to say nothing of the sometimes wildly inaccurate hitboxes on bosses and enemies, which sometimes teleported me into a grab from several feet away. Some overhead attacks from the bosses leave me with the impression that the hitbox on some of their weapons is 5 times wider than the actual blade itself.
His complaint about hitboxes is also misguided. Yes, some grabs can look silly, but with one sole exception in the entire game, it's not an issue with their hitboxes, but with their animations. In every Dark Souls game, there's no transition between when the player is free to when he's grabbed by an enemy. That would be way too difficult to animate, but as a result, grabs seldom look disjointed and can lead the player to feel as though the game cheated. This is a real issue, though a minor one, but it is present in previous games too, as well as in Dark Souls 3 to a lesser extent. The only bad grab hitbox in the entirety of Dark Souls 2 is the mimics. Dark Souls 1 had a couple bad grab hitboxes too, such as the Iron Golems. The other examples of supposedly bad hitboxes he provided really aren't worse than most in Demon Souls and Dark Souls. Other people have made videos to prove it, objectively, so I won't extend myself on this point.
Enemy designs in general are a big step down from Dark Souls 1. Nearly all of them are humanoids with similar movesets. The vast majority that don't conform to that style were all present in Dark Souls 1. Basilisks, wheel skeletons, giant rats, mimics and necromancers all originate from the first game. By comparison, Dark Souls 2 brings almost nothing new to the table. Even the exploding enemies are inexplicably human, when it would have made far more sense for them to be some weird type of fauna like the basilisk, especially considering the number of strange locations they end up in. I imagine the team have a lot of respect for Miyazaki, and it feels to me that crippled them from creating a more original experience. They probably didn't want to trample on the legacy of the previous games, so Dark Souls 2 ends up playing it very safe. As a result, too much of this game feels too familiar.
His next complaint is that most new enemies are humanoid shaped, which is rather subjective in nature, and is also plainly untrue, as he claims that the vast vast majority of non-humanoid creatures were present in Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2's base game features ogres, kobolds, pigs, and boars, flame lizards, darkstalkers, giant dogs, undead aberrations, poison moths, poison beetles, darksuckers, crag sleepers, spiders, and more. Not counting the DLCs, and not counting enemy types like the golems of the Dragon Shrine and those of the Tower of Flame, there's almost 20 new creatures in Dark Souls 2 that, just to clarify, were not present in Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 had around 20 of them as well, depending on what you consider distinct enough from a humanoid. Dark Souls 2 as a whole has 40 to 50 more enemies than its predecessor. Matthew misses the point by claiming it makes no sense for the exploding enemies to look humanoid. Those enemies are hollowed undead that were imprisoned in a misguided attempt of preventing the curse from spreading. The Mad King who jails them covers their eyes with bandages to avoid the cursed sparks of soul from leaving through their empty eye sockets, which cause their bellies to accumulate and be fermented by the artificially contained curse. They are later present in the area just beyond Aldia's keep, because Aldia experimented on them and later abandoned his mans, leaving them free to roam the place.
The Gutter is effectively the third time this kind of area has been done in the Souls games, and other areas like the Tower of Flame and Earthen Peak feel very reminiscent. Some of the bosses are outright lifted from Dark Souls 1, and the soundtrack pales in comparison.
Matthew complains that some concepts from previous games return once again, when, unlike Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 has an in-universe reason for bringing them back, as explained before. The continent where Dark Souls 2 takes place was populated by immigrants from Lordran, who brought with them their customs and so on. As was also explained before, one of Dark Souls 2's main themes is the cyclical nature of the world. History almost repeats itself, though Dark Souls 2 ingeniously subverts and builds upon all of the world building of Dark Souls 1, as carefully detailed in my video in which I explain its story. Of course the Tower of Flame feels reminiscent of Anor Londo, that's by design, and I mean in universe. Again, it was designed to serve as a reenactment of the journey of the chosen undead for immigrants of the New World. The Golems of Hyde mirror the Golem Sentinels of Anor Londo, and the Old Dragon's Lair, a golem designed to imitate Ornstein, mirrors, well, Ornstein, though it is made of silver instead of gold.
After beating the game, one of the first things I did was look up who the composer was, and I was completely shocked to find out it was the same person. The music in Dark Souls 2 feels so phoned in, with nearly every track feeling like an imitation of the Ornstein and Smough theme. That track in Dark Souls 1 was great, mostly because of the several different phases it morphed through, which lent energy and a sense of progression to the fight, but it's hardly representative of that game's music as a whole. Some of the other tracks were similarly bombastic, but lots of others went for a more sorrowful sort of tone, like the battles with Sif, Artorias, Gwyn, Priscilla, the Moonlight Butterfly and Dark Sun Gwyndolin. By comparison, Dark Souls 2 almost never breaks out of the mould. Velstalt is obviously designed to mirror the appearance and role of Garl Vinland from Demon Souls, but their tracks are worlds apart. I suppose this is all going to come down to taste, but I know which one I think is far more memorable. I'd say the same is true for the other music in general. Even the lesser tracks from Dark Souls had more personality to them, like Pinwheel and Seath. With the exception of the end boss theme, I found the soundtrack of Dark Souls 2 to be completely interchangeable. It's all perfectly serviceable, but if you ask me, that's a big step down.
His claim that the soundtrack pales in comparison to the previous games is also highly subjective. What is not, however, is the claim that every track feels like an imitation of Ornstein and Smough's, as well as the claim that the soundtrack is majorly bombastic and never breaks out of the mold. His opinion of the soundtrack being completely interchangeable and lacking in personality once again proves how little attention he pays to the game. I will now provide an analysis of some of the game's tracks to prove just how meaningful they are, and how they were meticulously crafted to portray the personality of the game's characters. As you'll hear, the soundtrack has a general horror theme, as does the game itself. The Last Giant's team accompanies what initially feels like a conventional boss fight, as a seemingly mindless Colossus lashes out in primal fury. But there's a lot beneath the surface, as is always the case in Dark Souls. The giant is spiteful because it recognizes the player, who would, later in his journey, defeat him in a memory. Though the giant has hollowed entirely, the memory of his fight against the protagonist was deeply imprinted into him. Once the player takes half of his HP, the giant rips his own arm off, as if he craved his old sword. It's as though the thrill of battle reminds him, though in a cloudy way, he used to be more than a mere beast. This emotional depth is mirrored in the music. There's a quiet dignity in the composition, as if mourning the fall of a king. As the battle progresses, a melancholic chorus emerges, adding a layer of tragedy to the confrontation. Then, the music swells with deep, resonant brass, granting the team weight and finality. This fight may be the first boss of the game, but it's a moment of ruin wrapped in sorrow and forgotten memory, as the last member of a species is killed off. New players may overlook the deeper implications of the fight, but for returning players, it takes a new meaning through recontextualization. The Pursuer track features ominous sounds of shackles, clinking in the distance, which is illustrative of his Japanese name, Cursebound. He's a vengeful spirit trapped in a suit of armor, cursed to forever wander the abyss in search of undead to hunt. The song's melody is accompanied by a deep, foreboding voice muttering in the background, almost like the ghost of a tormented soul is mumbling to himself. The old Dragon Slayer track evokes a heroic tone, which fits a glorious trial of strength that harkens to a bygone era. Yes, it is epic, but that's the point. It is an exception to the rule, however. Flexile Sentry's theme is subtle and ambient, matching the ship's gradual sinking and the water, which is rising slowly, to impair the player. It's neither loud nor epic. The low-key composition amplifies the claustrophobic atmosphere, and perfectly goes along with the environmental hazard of the fight. The Lost Sinners theme is like a descent into madness. From the opening notes, the music sways with an oscillating, deranged rhythm. The instrumentation is deliberately warped and distorted, evoking images of a foolish king, someone who once held power but has since lost all control. There's a subtle callback to the theme of the opening cinematic of Dark Souls 1, though the melody was corrupted, hinting at the parasitic possession of the Mad King. The track builds up to and culminates in a chill-inducing climax. Duke's Dear Freya has one of the most iconic themes in Dark Souls 2. It callbacks to Sif's theme from Dark Souls 1, and the arrangement is so cleverly done it can be played alongside the other theme, the vocals almost forming a duet of the more prominent masculine voice of the former and the feminine voice of the latter. Here's how the tracks sound when placed together. Instead of the iconic xylophone, there are strings that sound like spiders crawling through their nets. The track personifies the greed of the spider, with hints of its former glory, as it is akin to a distant descendant of the everlasting dragons. I could dissect each theme from Dark Souls 2 like this, and would love to do so, perhaps on a different video, but I think I've made my case for now. They are all rich with meaning and personality, composed with an extraordinary level of detail. Every From Software game from Demon's Souls onwards has a beautiful and profoundly meaningful soundtrack, it's nothing new. But to single out Dark Souls 2 as soulless is simply stupid, even if you subjectively prefer others over it.
The music may be a bit uninspired, but that's nothing compared to the completely rehashed story, which is once again about linking the fire. There's a few reasons why they shouldn't have gone down this road for the second time. First of all, there's the fact that the ending to Dark Souls 1 has been trampled on by the mere existence of Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 1, you got the impression that the two different endings you could choose from were in complete juxtaposition. Thanks to Dark Souls 2, we have to admit that, at best, the Link to Fire ending to Dark Souls 1 is canon, or, at worst, the ending to Dark Souls 1 makes no difference either way. If anything, Dark Souls 2 seems to hint at the latter with its talk of cycles, which is a transparent attempt to create an excuse for the inevitable Dark Souls 3. Blindly reusing the same ideas has also resulted in a game where the story and the world don't match the theme. In the intro and NPC dialogue, there's lots of talk of forgetting, people losing their grip on their pasts as they hollow. This could have made for a really compelling theme, but the game itself does little to back it up. Dark Souls 1 was about the end of an age, which was possibly the end of the world altogether. They drove this home with the theme of fire that clearly encapsulates the message. Eventually, every flame burns itself out. The bonfires in Estus are obviously designed to evoke this theme, and pyromancy was spun off into its own branch of magic, giving them a reason to include more fire spells. The introductory video starts by talking about fire, and the game itself ends at the kiln of the first flame. There's no equivalence in Dark Souls 2 apart from the giant memories, which are extremely brief and come right at the end of the story.
And now comes the most stupefying claim in the entire so-called critique. That the story of Dark Souls 2 is fanfiction, and undermines the endings of Dark Souls 1, and that it blindly reuses the same ideas, resulting in a game where the story and the roles don't match the themes. And he uses the theme of forgetfulness and identity as an example. The entire game takes place in the incomplete, mostly forgotten, murky memory of a once great continental empire. The whole of the game's layout is shaped around this theme. Drung Lake is a dreamlike, nightmare land, which Matthew, ironically, disregarded as nonsensically designed, missing the point entirely. Now he's complaining that the roles designed around the theme doesn't match the theme. Throughout the game, we meet a myriad of NPCs, whose character arcs center around identity and purpose. Nearly every one of them was written around this theme, very carefully and deliberately. All of them turned undead and came to Drung Lake, most of them with a specific purpose in mind, yes, they forget it. Lucatio travels to Drung Lake to find her missing brother. She tells you that she was raised as a warrior from birth, and became an exceptional swordsman, but her brother was even better than her. They used to fence together, and she couldn't beat him even once. As you advance through the game, she becomes increasingly afraid of forgetting who she is, and desperately talks to you about her plight. In her last encounter, after she'd finally defeated her brother, who was reduced to a haunted ghost, she can't even recall who you are, and has but one wish, for you to remember her name, for she may not herself. The Bellkeeper was artificially created, and later, reproduced in mass, to protect the belfries from invaders, so that the prince, and the princess who belongs to enemy nations could meet in secret, like Romeo and Juliet. Eventually, the prince and princess has to partake in arranged marriages, though they kept meeting in secret. As a mad king raids the Belfry Luna, and kills the then queen, the woman who'd created the Bellkeeper, he was driven to madness. He remains trapped in the motions of a task that had lost its purpose. Some of his copies would eternally haunt the belfries as ghosts. Benhart of Hugo betrayed his country for a legendary weapon that was offered to him by a rival nation. Benhart values the weapon over everything else, yet it was a fake. Because of his betrayal, he lost all that he had, his family and homeland, which he defected from. Out of shame, he lies about how he acquired his swords to the player, asserting, ironically, that it is a family heirloom, and wanders about aimlessly as a coping mechanism, looking for strong opponents to fight, like any mindless and nameless hollow. By meeting the player, however, he gets a chance to redeem himself, as we grant him a new purpose, and he helps us fulfill our own duty as a cooperator. Vengarl was a warrior who fought because he was born to, but as his head was detached from his body, and he was forced to be at peace by himself and introspect, free of his former purpose, he began to reflect on his condition and see the world in a new light, and as the player talks to him, he develops an appreciation for companionship as well. Once you vanquish his body, he offers you his help, now fighting for the sake of his new friends, for a purpose dear to him. It's a heartwarming story. Rosabeth, a minor, often overlooked character, is still written with care and nuance. She prioritizes comfort over her purpose because she doesn't see worth in herself. She is fascinated by sorcery and was headed to Tsaldora, the place where the soul of Sif was reincarnated, in search of her teacher, an ambitious scholar like her, but was petrified in the way and abandoned her goal, deciding to station herself in the safety of Majula. Once her master comes to the village, she says she's too embarrassed to talk to him, for she knows she's not up to his standards, and is too insecure to do anything about it. I could go on, but once again, I believe I've proved my point. Every single character, as in any Souls game, is masterfully written. Even those with no more than a few lines of dialogue are interesting and full of personality and charm. Most of them are, perhaps, too nuanced, their writing too subtle for the average player to appreciate, but that's not a fault of the writing. Now I'll talk about the endings of Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2 amazingly followed upon them. Both of them are canonically integrated into the story. There are two characters relevant to the story that have canonically acquired the Dark Lord's ending. Horus, the founder of the country of Hugo, and Vendrick, the main unplayable character of the game. It is also canonical that the Chosen Undead links to the fire, which is precisely why the souls of the beings he defeated in his journey were reincarnated in these new continents. The entirety of the world we explore in Dark Souls 2 only exists because of Dark Souls 1's endings.
This game could have easily just taken place very far away from Lordran and had nothing to do with linking the fire or the undead curse. All the team had to do was get a bit more creative. Alternatively, they could have just not linked it to Dark Souls 1 at all. I mean, who's to say the Dark Souls games need to take place in the same world? Of course, all this means they ended up retreading the lore of the first game as well as the story. If you're anywhere as cynical as I am, you might have seen this coming. One of the earliest questions I asked myself after they announced Dark Souls 2 was how much Solaire pandering there was going to be. I can't even begin to tell you how hard my eyes rolled once I read the description for the Great Lightning Spear and saw it talk about a grossly incandescent father. Solaire is one of my favourite characters in any of the Souls games, but he has absolutely no place in Dark Souls 2. We're talking about a time frame where nearly everything from the time of Lordran has been forgotten, but the one covenant which happens to survive intact just happens to be the same one the community won't shut up about. It makes no sense, and it's clearly just playing into the attachment people have to Solaire. You can even leave praise the sun messages if you want to run it even further into the ground. The last thing I ever wanted a Souls game to do was pander to people in this kind of way, especially since the games are known for their bleak atmospheres. Miyazaki fully expected people to like Solaire, but for the vast majority of players, he died a horrible death down in Lost Izalith.
Matthew bashes the developers for being uncreative, when he's demonstrated to not know a single thing about the story of the game he's talking about, and couldn't even grasp its basic plot. Like the average midwit, he confidently and arrogantly rambles about things he doesn't understand in the slightest, believing himself to be smarter than everyone else. He finishes that line of reasoning by saying Dark Souls 2 could even take place in a different world entirely, which is just so utterly stupid it boggles the mind. What does he even mean by that? Dark Souls is not Zelda. It is more like a Song of Ice and Fire, with each installment building upon the last as a greater narrative unfolds book through book. Matthew also complains that the Heirs of the Sun Covenant was brought to the New World, as if that's a nonsensical development in universe, done purely for fanservice's sake, which is such a moronic claim. The world of Dark Souls 2 was shaped by immigrants from Lordran, many of whom were journeying undead like the player character. Surely many of them would have joined the Heirs of the Sun Covenant to cooperate with each other. It stands to reason that the traditions and customs that originated in Lordran would reappear in the New World, though many of them went through interesting developments. Some were subverted entirely. Such details enrich the world of Dark Souls, turning it into an actual character, a living and breathing entity, just as ours is. Matthew then goes on to imply that, since we find an abandoned remnant of the Heirs of the Sun Covenant in Drang Lake, Solaire's death must have been retconned, when that is obviously false. He died a horrible death, but his shining legacy outlived him. The gleaming oath of companionship he preached, having survived the ruin of yet another land. It's a beautiful, poetic development. It shows that even a nobody can influence a world as bleak as Dark Souls for the better.
It's bad enough that Nashandra is connected to Manus, but New Game Plus reveals that the four old ones are connected to Nito, Gwyn, Seath and the Witch of Izalith. Without Miyazaki directing, this game may as well be fanfiction. The difference being some fanfiction writers would have the good sense not to bring back the spirit of every major boss from the last game.
Matthew's commentary steeps even lower, as he compares the writing of Dark Souls 2 to lazy fanfiction. I believe I've done more than enough to prove he's being foolish on this matter already, so I won't be repeating myself again and again about the masterfully crafted story of this wonderful game. I hope this video has kindled in you a newfound appreciation for Dark Souls 2. I didn't make it to slander Matthew, but to do my part in reshaping Dark Souls 2's reputation for the broader public. I am truly a passionate fan of the Dark Souls series, of From Software in general. I view these games as incredible works of art, among the most precious masterpieces humanity has ever created. Each of them has its own quirks, positives and negatives, and I appreciate them all for what they are, and love them for it. And this is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog in which I post in-depth analysis of works of an esoteric nature, ranging from movies to manga to music clips, as well as my insights on philosophy and religion, you can check out my Patreon.